The young lady had one excellent talent. She could easily remember everything she read and saw once. She easily remembered all the novels she read, which helped her in her later lives. The maid hurriedly called her mistress. The villain of the novel, Arinde Maleficent, a beautiful young lady. The lady looked closely at the maid, because she realized that she was the main villain's maid. Looking in the mirror, the young lady realized that she was in the body of the main villain. Anna told the lady that today was the entrance ceremony to the academy. The young lady was puzzled because she realized that the time coincided with the beginning of the novel and the entrance ceremony to the academy. She knew that it was written there that the main character and the villain studied at the same academy. The young lady was surprised that she had such a realistic dream because her maid was like a real person. Madame told the lady that even though she was the daughter of the Maleficent family, she had to behave decently at the academy. She told the young lady that for her behavior, she should be punished by walking 3 laps around the stadium at a goose step. The young lady was shocked that she was forced to do something like that. She wanted to close her eyes to it, as it was a dream. But a moment later she fell to the ground. With a thud, she was in great pain, and she was confused. She was shocked that she felt pain in her sleep. Only after a week of torment did she realize that it was not a dream at all, but reality. She understood that if everything around her was real, then she could not live the life of a villain. She didn't know what to do to get back. She knew things would turn out differently because she wasn't a villain. The villain of this novel was very cunning and sly. The villain was a character who was executed by the protagonist. Unfortunately, her death occurred in the prime of her youth. The young lady unfortunately did not know how to get out of the affair, so she had to make a choice. She had the choice to hope for a return to reality when her role was fulfilled, and to be executed having lived a short and brave life. She could have destroyed the original story by winning over all the male heroes and living a long and peaceful life. A moment later she was taken aback and started with fear as she was called. Madame was furious because the young lady was again doing something else during class. Madame shouted to her student that she must be punished and immediately goose step. Sometime later, the young lady carried out her punishment. After a short walk, she fell to the ground with a thud, knowing that she might die if things continued like this. No matter how much she thought she had only one solution to the problem, she was puzzled because she knew that there was no other way. Unfortunately, the young lady had never been in a relationship, and now she was still trapped in the body of a villainess. She wondered how she could seduce some hero. Sometime later, the young lady slowly returned to class. She froze for a moment in front of the mirror as she noticed that Erinda was actually very beautiful. The main character is Serena Eleanor, a bright, neat, and beautiful lady. The lady knew that if it weren't for the main characters, she would have courted the young lady herself. In fact, she had no other choice from the very beginning, because her family was the most influential in the empire. The imperial family betrothed them to the crown prince in order to maintain power that was before her, fall into an affair, and that cannot be changed. It is impossible to break off an engagement without a serious reason, such as political treason. Around this time, the prince fell in love with another girl. Unfortunately, she could not prevent it. Unfortunately, the young lady had only one option left, and that was death. It was hard for her to decide and live her life as a villain because the main character was a bright person. Arinda was puzzled because she saw that the main character was too kind and charming. Arinda, in turn, did not understand how she could mock such a bright girl. She sighed heavily as she understood that she simply had no choice. She knew she had to follow the main plot. Unfortunately, she made the young lady suffer. With tears in her eyes, she ran away and did not help the main character, while she was consumed by guilt for what she had done. Later, she made the main character's life difficult with the help of her family's power. Particularly helpful was the brother who had feelings for the main character, but she rejected him. He mocked her using his sister. Serena, who would most likely gain all the power after the groom was kidnapped, was certainly not a friend of Maleficent's family. But to prevent Serena from encroaching on power, the family members used Ariinda as a shield. and committed atrocities. Arinde just turned a blind eye to everything because she was trying to follow the original story. She just wanted the main character to survive all the hardships and come to a happy ending. Arinde mentally asked Serena for forgiveness because it really hurt her to do this. But sometime later, the young lady was sentenced to death for committing atrocities against an innocent citizen of the empire. The prince broke off relations with her and sentenced her to death for causing harm to his beloved. Her father and brothers, the shield. She was abandoned her to certain death. Arinde felt a little sorry for leaving a wound on Serena's face, but it was already predetermined, and she had no other choice. Arinde angrily shouted at the main character that she hated her. With cold fury, she screamed that they hated her from the depths of their souls. Arinde looked at the young lady intently, knowing that her words were a complete lie. After all, she actually really liked the main character. But she knew that this was the end of her story, and she mentally said goodbye to the bright main heroine. She sighed heavily, as she knew that this was truly the end for her. Now she hoped that she would be able to return to reality. She understood that otherwise she might simply die, and her soul would disappear. But what was in store for her left her in shock, and she woke up screaming in pain. The young lady froze in shock and breathed heavily. A moment later, a maid entered her room and called her. Arinde froze in place in surprise, as she did not expect to see a maid. The maid said with a smile that today was the entrance ceremony. The young lady froze in shock. She sighed heavily and wondered if she was really back. She was shocked because she still had echoes of the pain that pierced her at the moment of death. She was shocked because she now realized that she was back to square one. She knew that since she was back, she needed to shed her villain status and live a normal life. She understood that everything would be fine if she just lived her life. She looked at the main character with a joyful smile because she knew that he would not mock her. The prince looked at the lady intently and said with a grin that he did not need 2 wives. With a wicked grin, he said that Serena wouldn't like it. She was in shock, wondering if he was crazy, because she knew there was no reason for execution. She sighed heavily because she realized that she could not escape her fate. She knew that if she died, she could say anything. A moment later, the young lady casually said that the prince was simply crazy. She mockingly said that if he continued to make rash decisions after becoming emperor, he would be immediately overthrown. The crown prince froze in place, in shock, because he did not expect this. But a moment later, he burst into wild laughter at her words. He came closer to her and said that it seemed she had gone mad, realizing that she would soon become a headless, cold-blooded corpse. The prince said that he had already spoken to her family. A moment later, the young lady burst into wild laughter. She sighed heavily as she realized that her family had taken advantage of her this time too. She sighed heavily as she was already tired of the life of a young villain. She just wanted to die peacefully, but when she opened her eyes, she froze in place as she heard the maid calling her. She sighed heavily as she realized that she had once again been reborn in the body of a villainess. She was puzzled, as this was not the first time she had heard the maid grumbling. She looked closely into the mirror, as she had already become accustomed to her face. Anna looked at the lady in surprise and asked if she could hear her. The young lady answered her maid briefly and monosyllabically. She looked at the maid with a joyful smile and said that, of course, she was listening to her. Arinde knew very well that the maid was with her until the very end, every time. The maid helped her the most in torturing the main character. And in the end, death awaited her at the end of every life. The young lady, in turn, was puzzled, since she had brought an innocent servant to death. Anna looked at her mistress with a joyful smile and slowly helped her get ready. The young lady was surprised to see before her a man who had already died several times. She sighed heavily, knowing that this was not surprising, since she had also died several times. She sighed heavily, as she was confused about being transported into a novel and going back in time in a novel. She knew that if she saw God, she would tell him everything. The maid smiled and told her mistress that she would succeed, but she wanted to say something else. Arinde knew that the phrase given was like instructions for a game. Anna smiled and said that she was a lady of a great house, and many young men might be interested in her. She said that the lady already had a fiancé, so she had to turn down the rest of the suitors. The lady knew that her fiancé would fall in love with the main character and betray her. She raised that, of course, the lady was very beautiful. She understood perfectly well that the problem was in the prince's personality itself, because he had already killed her several times. Anna told the lady that she should know that she would always have her back. But the young lady knew that she should not expect any good from her family. She knew that the crown prince and the duke were the bane of her existence. The young lady was furious because she knew that without them, her life would have been long and wonderful. She wanted to just pretend to be crazy and break off the engagement, but she knew her family wouldn't allow it. Anna smiled and told the lady that she should always be confident and determined. She knew that the crown prince and the duke were the true villains of the novel. She was well aware that she would die anyway and could now do whatever she wanted before her death. She looked into the distance with a joyful smile, as she understood that now she would do whatever she wanted. She smiled and told the lady that she needed to greet her father before leaving, but the young lady did not want to do so. Arinde understood perfectly well that even if she went, the duke would not say anything important. She wanted to let the maid get away with it, since she had died several times because of her. A moment later, the maid knocked on the door and told the master with a smile that a young lady had come to greet him. He said she could come in. The young lady was irritated, as his voice alone made her stomach churn. The duke sighed heavily and told his daughter that today was her first day at the academy. He looked at her intently and beckoned her towards him. She looked at the duke intently, for she knew the meaning of the smirk on his face. He was hypocritical and disgusting. The duke grinned and told his daughter that she should come to him. The young lady, in turn, said with a grin that she did not want to do this. The duke froze in shock because he did not expect this. He did not understand what kind of manner of speech his daughter had. She casually said that this was not what she wanted to hear from a father who didn't even remember the ceremony where his only daughter entered the academy. She was the only daughter of the family and the crown prince's fiancé, and he didn't want to hurt her. She understood perfectly well that she was now in a winning position. He said that he had a lot to do and did not have time to worry about her. She sighed heavily and said that she agreed with him and he could let her go about her business. She said with a smile that in return he should take care of her monthly pocket money. She knew that from now on she would eat to her heart's content, have fun, and live for her own pleasure, so she needed money. The duke froze in shock as he did not expect to hear anything like that. She smiled and said that in that case she was leaving. She wanted him to think a little in his spare time and send her a lot of money, and she wanted to increase the amount of his expenses next time. Sometime later, the young lady was riding in a carriage to the academy. She sighed heavily, as this was the third time she was entering the academy. She has already taken the entrance exams several times. The young lady was very excited because she had always studied very hard in order to get in. Although perhaps it would have been much better if she had not acted, because at least she would not have died. The maid left with tears in her eyes and asked her mistress to write her letters. The young lady said goodbye to her maid because she was grateful to her. She came to the academy too early, so she didn't know what to do because she had a lot of free time. The young lady looked around slowly, and a moment later she approached a small fountain. She sighed heavily and looked intently at the fountain because she knew it was the same one. Earlier, she pushed the main character into the fountain. Arinde was surprised because the young lady remained very beautiful even then. Arinde was well aware of the fact that no one could compare to the main character in beauty. She knew that no matter how handsome the prince was, because of his bad character, he did not deserve to be with the main character. Arinde knew that there were many handsome guys around the main character. Arinde was sitting quietly by the fountain, thinking about the plot of the novel, when suddenly someone tapped her on the shoulder. The young lady flinched and screamed, as she did not expect anything like this. Serena looked at the young lady in surprise and asked for forgiveness. Serena smiled and asked the lady if she was very scared. Arianda sighed heavily and said that she was not. Arinde was puzzled because she kept getting her words mixed up in front of the heroine, but in turn, she knew that the villain was not that kind of character. Arianda sighed, as she had already decided to live the way she wanted anyway, and now she didn't have to worry about anything. She looked at the young lady with a joyful smile and asked if something had happened. Serena smiled and said that she was terrible at directions and asked where the banquet hall was. Arinde froze for a moment at the young lady's stunning smile. She felt as if she were talking to her favorite celebrity, being just a few centimeters away from her. The young lady smiled sheepishly and said that, of course, she would take her. Serena looked at the young lady in surprise, and a moment later said that her ribbon was also red. Arinde smiled happily and said that they were from the same stream, so they could drop the formalities. She sighed heavily because she knew that was exactly what she needed to answer. Serena looked at the girl with a smile and asked if they could skip the formalities. She smiled and said that they could communicate freely because it seemed to her that they were destined to meet. Arinde froze in place for a moment, but after a few seconds, she happily agreed with the young lady. They talked for a while. Serena told her friend that she seemed to be the bride of the crown prince. Arinda was told by the young lady that she should not worry about her status because this was an academy and everyone was equal. Serena smiled and told the lady that she was very kind. Arianda looked away and said that she was not as kind as the young lady thought. Serena smiled and said that she was an expert in people, and the young lady was indeed a good person. Arianda looked at Serena because she understood that she was not particularly picky about people, because out of all the guys, she chose the crown prince. After a short conversation, they found out that they were in the same class. Arianda glared at the lady, knowing that she was constantly making fun of her and trying her best to avoid her. She wondered if the young lady was really saying that she was glad to be in the same class with her. Arinde said with a smile that it was really amazing and good. A moment later, they arrived at the banquet hall. Serena smiled shyly and said that they still had plenty of time, so she suggested that they walk some more. Arinde smiled and said that she would be happy to do so. Arinde said that they could leave their things in the banquet hall and take a lot of walks. For Arinda, because she knew what happened in past lives, namely what kind of relationship she had with the main character. She knew that she died every time because of the prince, indirectly of course, but still he gave the order. She knew that in this life, not even an hour had passed since their meeting, but it seemed to her as if they had been friends all their lives. Serena said it looked like they were the first ones to arrive. Opening the door, the young lady froze in place because she saw the crown prince. The prince looked at the young lady intently and coldly called her by name. The prince said that she was the first person he met at the academy. He sighed heavily and said that it was very surprising. Serena looked at her friend in surprise and asked if there was really someone inside. Arianda said that there was no one. Arinda turned around and said with a happy smile that it was just a dog barking somewhere. The young lady was surprised. Arianda smiled and said that she was sure it was something in dog language. The prince froze in shock. A moment later, the young lady slammed the door shut. Grabbing the young lady by the hand, she ran into the distance. Arinde was very glad that she had acted in this way because this act refreshed her. She remembered the expression on the prince's face with a joyful smile and realized that it was worth it. She understood perfectly well that no matter what she did, the date of death would not change anyway. Until then, she sometimes wanted to take it out on those around her. The young lady plucked the flower with a joyful smile because she saw that the flowers were very beautiful. At the same time, Arinde wondered if there was a way to separate the prince from the lady forever. She understood perfectly well that no matter what happened, the young lady would still fall in love with the insolent prince. She was puzzled because she knew that for some stupid reason, her head would be cut off. She was puzzled because she understood that she would return again and live the same life as before. The lady asked her friend if something was bothering her, and Arinde said in surprise that nothing was bothering her. Serena said she was in a good mood before, but now she looks a little down. Looking away from the young lady, she said it was all about her ability. Arinde looked at the young lady in surprise, as she remembered a passage from the novel. The young lady's magical gift was to read people's emotions. Thanks to him, she saw the true feelings of the cold crown prince, and so they became closer to each other. Arinde smiled and said that if she didn't want to tell, she didn't have to. The young lady said with a happy smile that it seemed she had done the right thing in talking to her today. The young lady smiled and handed her new friend the flower because it was her eyes. Serena smiled and told the young league that she was beautiful. Arinde was very embarrassed by her words, but at the same time she felt guilty for what she had done earlier. A moment later, they saw the young people and realized that it was time for them to go. Arinde sighed heavily as she realized that now the story had truly begun. She was perfectly aware that the main character would meet the main hero in the banquet hall. Then the young people felt that they were right for each other. Arinde thought he had fallen in love with her at first sight, but now she knew he was the king of pretense. The young lady was surprised as she noticed many people hurrying through the academy. She smiled and told her friend that it was a good thing they didn't leave their things there. A moment later, they leisurely entered the hall. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it seemed they were late. Arinde smiled and said that it was not that at all. A moment later, she told her friend where they could sit. Arinde froze for a moment as she saw the prince walking towards her. She was surprised, did not understand what was happening, and gave up on her. Did he really decide to approach her himself this time? The prince grabbed the young lady by the hand and, pulling her towards him, called her by name. He asked angrily how she could say such a thing and run away after her words. The lady was shocked. She wondered if he had gone crazy. The young lady looked closely at her friend and called out timidly. She froze for a moment when she saw the prince's red eyes, but still looked closely at her friend. Arinde was puzzled and shouted at the prince to wait a little, as the ceremony was about to begin. The prince looked at the lady with fury and asked if she really wanted to lose her head for insulting a royal person. She was furious because she knew he would kill her anyway. The young lady in turn resisted as best she could, but it was all in vain. A moment later, she pulled away from his tight grip. He looked at her intently, asked if she understood what she had done wrong. The young lady, in turn, did not see what she had done wrong. He was amazed because she spoke to him informally. She said she didn't see why they should focus on status when they were at the academy. She said that he was dumped at the academy because he had done something wrong, and the prince was shocked and didn't understand how she found out. The green boy was going to execute an innocent subordinate without even understanding the situation. Of course, he did not do this, but in the hope that his son would come to his senses and become wiser, the king sent him to the academy. The young lady looked at him intently and said that he would not be able to get the support of the imperial family for the next few years. She mockingly said that if he wanted her to address him as the crown prince, then she could do so. He sighed heavily and said that if she continued in the same spirit, she could be sure that she would be punished after graduation. She smiled and said that she would continue to do this, as she did not care about the punishment, since she was going to die anyway. She smiled and asked if he would break off the engagement. The prince said that it seemed that was all she wanted. The young lady turned around in a hurry as she realized that the ceremony had already begun. She looked intently at the princess and said that she was already leaving, and she also smiled and asked if he could get there himself. With the speed of lightning, she left the prince and realized that now it was too late for her to retreat. The prince looked after her in surprise as he realized that the young lady had gone crazy. She understood that whether it was reality or a novel, the world was still cruel. She knew they were both late, but she was the only one punished. She was glad she remembered about the body improvement magic. A moment later, she noticed a young man who was also being punished. She came closer to him and asked with a smile if he was a scholarship student in Reynolds' fencing class. She was puzzled because he ignored her. She knew that in the novel, there was not even a scene where he spoke normally. The stupid knight silently protected the main character from behind. He was an unhappy supporting character, the main character, who never confessed his feelings. Unfortunately, she knew that he was terribly late, often, but still he was her favorite character. With the help of magic, the young lady managed to catch up with the young knight. She smiled and said that yesterday he was late for the entrance ceremony, or rather, he overslept. He looked at her in surprise, but said nothing in response. A moment later, he asked if it wasn't difficult to walk and talk. She was surprised that she was able to start a conversation. She smiled and said that her legs didn't hurt, so she wanted to talk to him. But a moment later, fatigue washed over her, and he overtook her and ignored her. The young lady was puzzled, because she just wanted to talk to him a little. She didn't want to use magic anymore, because she knew that she could get into trouble, but she was aware of the fact that she shouldn't let him go now. With lightning speed, she caught up with the young man and said that they could talk since they were comrades in misfortune. He asked in surprise if she could really recover. Reynolds said she must have trained a lot too. A moment later, she introduced herself with a smile. Looking away from the young lady, he said that she seemed to be late for the entrance ceremony yesterday. He asked if she was from the fencing class. She came and said that she didn't know anything about it. He said in surprise that such endurance could only be developed through hard training. She smiled and said that it was magic. She froze for a moment as she remembered that the young man liked honest people. He associated with honest and kind people and hated those who would step over others for the sake of their task. She knew he wouldn't like such a trick because she was using magic dishonestly. She knew he would look at her with disdain and ask how she could have cheated in the process of atoning for her guilt. She smiled and said that everything becomes easier when you walk like this for an hour every day. He was surprised. She smiled and said that she had been walking like that for several hours. He looked at her in surprise as he suspected that something was wrong with her words. She was shocked because she knew he hated lies. A moment later, he told her that she needed to take up fencing, as her talent might simply go to waste. Reynolds said that he was currently in Class B, and also asked what class she was in. The young lady said that she was studying in Class A. She practices magic, along with her main character, and studies in Class A. The young man who was engaged in fencing was in Class B. The Crown Prince, who was a tactician by nature, was in Class C. Milady, in turn, thought for a moment. After remembering all the main characters, she remembered that there was a candidate for the position of the main character in their class. Reynolds said that in the second place, she would be given the opportunity to change classes, so she should think about it carefully. She said that she was not a very good swordsman, and the young man said that he could teach her. He said that she was very resilient, and if she practiced hard, she would definitely become a good swordsman. A moment later, the young lady said she suddenly felt short of breath. He looked at her closely and said that he knew she was lying. She sighed heavily, but said nothing. A moment later, the young lady met her friend. Arindi looked at the young man in surprise because she didn't understand why he was following her around. Taking the scarf from her, he asked if her name was Arinda. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed like she hated fencing so much that she was willing to lie to him. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and asked if she really hated fencing. She smiled and said that it had only started recently. She was in shock, wondering if she should tell him that she had just used magic. He smiled and said that if she studied with him, she would like it. The young man invited the young lady to train together. He looked at her intently, expecting an answer. She had completely forgotten that she was attracted to beautiful appearance. Sir, with a joyful smile, she agreed. She smiled tenderly and said that she seemed to have changed her mind abruptly and now enjoyed fencing. He smiled and said they could start with lunch tomorrow. She smiled and agreed. She was well aware that the young man would soon fall in love with the main character. Serena was a little excited because she saw that her friend wanted to train with a strong opponent one-on-one. Serena, she told her friend that they were very worried about her. The young lady smiled and said that everything would be fine. She smiled and said that she would like to become friends with the young man because he is very nice, Arinde did not understand why the main character was afraid of the young man, because this had never happened before. A moment later, they heard a siren and knew it was time to get ready. Arinde smiled and said that she had a brother who studied at the academy, and he knew everything. Serena said her brother was constantly winking at her and even blowing kisses. The young lady was puzzled and asked her friend to forgive her brother. Sometime later, they were at the academy and discussing the upcoming classes. A moment later, a young man entered the office and called the young lady as the crown prince wanted to speak with her. A moment later, he shouted that the crown prince was looking for her. She sighed heavily and said that it was very good because she had something to tell him. A few minutes later, she burst into the office. She shouted furiously at the prince that she didn't care who he was, but if he had business with her, he should come himself and not she to him. He looked at her in surprise. She said that she was very worried that he was left without legs, but fortunately, she saw that everything was in place. She said that thanks to someone she was even lucky enough to get to the goose step. She looked at the prince with a smirk and said that next time she hoped he would join her too. A moment later, with the speed of lightning, she slammed the door and left. Arinde returned to class with lightning speed. A moment later, she bumped into a young man. He greeted her with a smile and said he was impressed by her passionate statement. He smiled and said that they were in the same class and also asked if she didn't know him. She said his name was Luke Oscar. He said with a smile that he could guess that she recognized him. He was one of the contenders for the role of the main character of the novel. He said with a smile that wherever he went, he was popular. Arinde left. She told him to move away because she was late for class. He said with a smile that if she was late, then he would be late too. She looked at him in surprise and asked why they didn't go into class together. She didn't want to get involved with him because he was always getting into trouble. He said with a smile that he would agree. If she listened to his request, she asked if she could refuse in advance. He smiled and said it was a win-win for her. She hoped he wasn't going to ask her to help build a bridge between him and Serena. She started to speak, but he interrupted her and asked them to be partners. The young lady froze in shock as she did not expect this. Luke asked, laughing if she really thought he would ask her to introduce him to his friend. He smiled and said he wanted them to be partners. He said that, in order to maximize learning or research results, class members choose a partner. She sighed heavily and said that they were not compatible with each other, so she refused. He said that if they were partners, she wouldn't have to worry about her grades, but the young lady still refused the offer. He said that she should think carefully because such a chance rarely came. She asked if she could leave because she was late. The young lady was surprised and did not understand why he suddenly suggested something like this to her, since she had not done anything to him. A moment later, she felt magic behind her. Turning around, she blocked his magic with lightning speed. She was shocked because he used compulsion magic on her. He smiled and said that canceling someone else's magic was not something that a newly enrolled student could do. The young lady was puzzled because she had just made a mistake. Luke said with a happy smile that this was the reason they should be partners. She knew that the others were acting differently because she was acting contrary to the original, but she didn't understand what was wrong with Luke. She wondered how he even knew she could use magic. Luke looked at her with a smile and offered to be partners. For some time, he did not stop asking her because he wanted her to be his partner. Serena noticed that her friend was in a bad mood. Arinde smiled and said that everything was fine, but she hit the young man. He smiled and said that since she was in a good mood, she didn't need to refuse. The young people discussed Luke's proposal for some time. Arinde said that even if she had heard the reason, she would still have refused. He said with a smile that this was the reason why he didn't tell her the reason. A moment later, the young man burst into wild laughter, and the young lady in turn looked intently at the recipe. Arinde looked at Serena intently, not understanding how she could be so beautiful. Arinde knew that Luke would soon fall in love with the main character. Luke in turn looked intently at Arinde without looking away. Luke asked with a gentle smile if she had changed her mind, and Arinde shouted that she had not. Luke sighed heavily and said that it seemed like she didn't like his handsome face. Ariande sighed, as because of Luke, the three of them did almost all the tasks in the group together. The lady asked her friend what she was going to do today, and Arinde asked in bewilderment what she was talking about. She whispered to her friend that she was talking about Reynolds now. After all, she knew that the young man almost got into a fight with Luke yesterday. She remembered how the young man had asked her earlier if she had forgotten about their training session today. Arinde said that she certainly remembers the training. Luke sighed heavily and told the young man that it looked like he was trying to teach a mage how to fence, and that was stupid. Reynolds said that with practice, the young lady's basic physical strength would increase. Luke laughed and asked the young man if he believed it himself. The young lady understood perfectly well that the main character was not her at all, and all the events should revolve around Serena. But for the past few days, she felt as if she had become the center of history. Serena asked the lady how the prince was feeling, because she had recently passed by him, and he looked as if he was confused. The young lady, in turn, understood that he felt this way because of her, but she did not understand why. She asked anxiously if she had really seen the prince up close. She wanted to know if they had spoken. Serena smiled and said that they didn't know each other at first. She told the young lady that the prince was her fiancé, and he had no reason to be interested in her. Arinde was shocked and wondered how the story had gotten so twisted that the prince ignored the main character. She was puzzled because she understood that her life was cursed. She wondered if she should erase the prince's memory. She wanted to give up everything and run away. The young lady smiled, and looking at her friend, said that everything was fine, and that she should not be afraid of what had not yet happened. She told her friend that she didn't know what had happened to her, but she would always be there for her. She knew that nothing had happened yet, and the prince was silent. For now she hoped that she had shocked him, and he was going to break off the engagement. A moment later she turned around, as she heard the prince calling her. He looked at her intently, and said that this time he came himself, as she asked, because they needed to talk. She looked closely at the prince as she walked behind him, and realized that she had no reason to be afraid of him. She understood perfectly well that they were now in the academy, and this place was safe for students. She understood that she had already died several times, and she had nothing to fear. Luke quietly approached the young lady and asked if she was so afraid to follow her fiancé. He smiled and said that he saw that they were in a tense situation, and he decided to follow them. She was worried because he left the main character. He said with a smile that it would be more interesting for him here. A few seconds later, he made fun of the young lady, and she responded with magic. He said with a smile that from the very beginning, he was only interested in her. The young man parried her blow with lightning speed and directed it at the prince. A moment later, a magical blow reached the prince. The young lady looked at her friend with a smile and said that she was happy now. With lightning speed, the prince turned and looked intently at the young people. He looked at the young man in bewilderment and asked who he was. A moment later, the young lady struck her friend and told the prince that he should not pay attention to the young man because he was crazy. Luke smiled and said that she was right and the prince should just ignore him. The young lady looked sideways at her friend and said that it was not a compliment at all. The prince looked at the girl intently and said that because of the fuss she had made last time, he had found himself in an absurd position. He said she had insulted a member of the royal family in front of everyone and asked if she expected him to show mercy. She wondered if he wanted to execute her right now. She didn't know if she should kill him first. She was furious because she knew that if he hadn't killed her over and over again, this wouldn't have happened. He said that this kind of behavior was unacceptable for her. Before he asked if she had really gone crazy, Arinde sighed heavily and said that it made no difference because he would kill her again anyway. He was surprised because she said that he would kill her again. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed that his hearing was very good. Luke looked at her in surprise and asked if the prince was trying to kill her. Because of that incident, she said that he would definitely kill her someday. Luke smiled and said they were very funny. He asked with a smile if she regretted what she had said, and the lady said that she did not regret anything. He said with a smile that this was the reason he liked her very much. The prince, in turn, looked at her intently and said that he could not let her get away with this term. He said that her behavior was a clear insult to the imperial family, and she should know what the price was for it. He said that he had no right to execute her at this time, and it seemed that there was a misunderstanding between them. He said that if she repented of her sins throughout her studies, he would forgive her, but she couldn't stand it, and making an obscene gesture sent him away. Luke was shocked and surprised by the young lady's behavior. With lightning speed, he grabbed her hands and said with a smile that he liked her very much. Arinde said she didn't want to. He liked it. He smiled and said it was okay, because that's what he felt. The prince looked at the young lady with fury and said that it seemed she had gone completely mad. He said that even though she had power, she could still pay for her disrespect, and she asked with a smirk if he was trying to threaten her. He asked if she really didn't care about the fate of her brother and father. She smiled and said that she didn't care. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that she would only be glad if they died together because she wanted to take revenge on them. The young man shouted with a joyful smile that they liked her for this, and she used her lightning speed to cast magic on him. The prince looked at her closely and said that as far as he knew, she had not studied magic before. Luke was surprised that she hadn't studied magic and was now at an amazingly high level. He smiled and asked, "What about Togo and them being partners after all?" She sighed heavily and asked the young man, "How about Togo?" discerning when he should intervene and when he shouldn't. Luke smiled and said that now would be the best time to do so. A moment later, she looked back in surprise as she saw that he had used magic. She was surprised that he had used promise magic. The young man leaned closer to her with a happy smile and said that his offer to become partners, also including yourself and joining the magic tower, he said that she probably knew better than him what that meant. The magic tower was officially responsible for keeping the imperial family in check so they could not harm each other. The young lady froze for a moment, as she knew that if she became his partner, the prince would no longer be able to kill her. She looked at the prince intently, for she knew that the wizards of the magic tower were so precious that they were chosen once every 20 years. In her past life, she had never dared to dream of such a thing. But then she had not communicated with the young man. Arinde looked at the young man in surprise, as she did not understand why he chose her. Luke smiled and said that their magic tower needed brave people like her, because the current leader was a little sick, so he couldn't argue with the emperor. Luke said that this was the only entertainment for the wizards in the magic tower, and now it was very boring there. The prince was surprised and annoyed, because for such a trivial reason, he wanted her to be hired did not enter the tower. Luke smiled and said that if she became the sorceress of the magic tower, she would survive even if they decided to exterminate her entire family. She understood that if she followed the young man, the story would become completely confused, but for a time she could avoid the fate of being killed by the prince. She wondered if she had a chance to live a long life. She knew that if she did, she would be able to breathe deeply. Arinde looked closely at the young man and agreed to be his partner. He smiled a gentle smile and said that if they became partners, he promised that he would give her the status of a wizard of the magic tower. A moment later, the young man used his magic. The young lady quickly turned around and looked at the prince as he was stunned by what he saw. She was glad that she had managed to change her destiny. Luke took her hand with a smile and told her that from now on, she didn't have to worry about the prince killing her at any moment. But unfortunately, she wouldn't be able to do that either. She looked at the prince intently and said that he had already heard that she could not kill him. Arinde finally said that she really hoped that he himself would die somehow. A moment later, they disappeared into thin air. The prince froze in shock, as he did not understand what had happened. The madam looked at the young people with fury and said that they were late for class and also used teleportation magic in the academy. There was quite a commotion, so the madam said that they should follow her. After class was over, the young lady was shocked. A moment later, they were serving their well-deserved punishment. The young lady sighed heavily and asked her new friend if he really hated her. Luke smiled and asked if that was even possible since they were now comrades. Orinde screamed that it was a lie. She didn't understand why he teleported into the auditorium. A moment later, the young lady tripped and fell to the ground with a crash. With lightning speed, the young man grabbed the young lady by the hand and held her in place. He looked at her with a smile and told her that she needed to be careful. He said that they were late for class, so he wanted to get there faster because magic is a very convenient thing. She sighed heavily as she knew that he was the next head of the magic tower. He smiled and asked why she didn't just use body enhancement magic since she could do it. He knew that she used similar magic last time. Sometime later, they finished with the punishment. The young lady was puzzled because she was very tired. Serena ran to her friend with lightning speed. Serena looked at the young lady with concern and said that she was all sweaty. Arinda smiled and thanked her friend for the handkerchief and also said that she would wash it and return it. The lady smiled and said that it was not worth doing, but Arinda still wanted to repay her friend for her kindness. A moment later, Madame approached them and said, "Young lady," that even though she was the daughter of the Maleficent family, she should not break the rules of the academy. The young lady sighed heavily and nodded silently in response, because this was not the first time she had heard such words. Luke smiled and said that they couldn't let this go unpunished just because it was the Duke's family. Arianda looked at the young man and asked if he remembered asking why she didn't use body-enhancing magic. A moment later, she shouted to the professor that the young man had used magic. Madame was furious. A moment later, the professor was screaming furiously at her student. The lady looked at the young man intently and said that he was punished again and had to walk around the stadium 5 more times, and this time she would personally supervise him. The young man was taken aback as he had not expected this. A moment later, he shouted to the young lady, the note enjoying her victory. The ladies slowly returned back. Serena sighed heavily and asked her friend, "What about her?" Arinda asked her, in surprise, what she was talking about. Serena sighed heavily and said timidly that there was actually something interesting from the very beginning. She asked the young lady if it was possible that she didn't like her and she was forcing herself to be friends with her. Arianda was shocked by this question. She shouted that this was not so and that this simply could not be. Although she felt hostility towards the prince, she never hated the main character. Arinda grabbed the young lady by the hands and said that she liked her very much. Serena stood frozen in place in surprise for a moment. But after a few seconds, she said with her happy smile that she also liked the young lady and was glad that they became friends. Arindi grabbed the young lady's hand with lightning speed and pulled her aside. The young lady was worried because she didn't know where they were going. Arinde said with a playful smile that she wanted to show her sincerity. A moment later, they were in the bakery, and the young lady happily told the sellers to wrap them up with more of everything. "Young lady, I wanted to show my feelings to my friend." Serena sighed heavily, and looking at her friend, said that she shouldn't have asked such a stupid question because she understood her feelings. Arinda said that they still needed to buy more. Serena said that was enough, and also offered to share some bread with Luke, because he must have suffered a lot. Arindi told her friend not to worry so much, as she was sure that he used restoration magic as soon as he finished everything. Serena told her friend that he was her partner after all, and needed to be taken care of. Arinde sighed heavily and said that she had wanted to be paired with the young lady from the beginning. She was about to suggest it when the jam potion lesson ended. She remembered the young man saying that his offer included joining the magic tower, and she should know better than he what that meant. Serena looked downcast and told Arinda that if it was true, she would have said it right away. Serena said that she could assume that the young lady was telling the truth, but still she chose Luke as her partner later. Serena sighed heavily and told her friend that once an opportunity was missed, it would never come back. Arinda froze in place for a moment in confusion because she knew it was true. She sighed heavily and said that she did not understand how this was connected with the fact that she needed to treat the young man with bread bought with her money. She sighed heavily and said that of course she would share with him. Serena said that she didn't know why, but the kids in her class didn't really like them, so she wanted them to get along. A moment later, the young man came closer to them and called out to the young lady. Arinda looked at him intently and greeted him. A moment later, the young man greeted them back. She looked at him in surprise and wondered if he was a robot. She came closer to him and asked if he had just finished fencing practice. She assumed that he was very tired, so she asked if he had had time to eat. Arinda timidly looked away from the young man and said that last time he and Luke had a small squabble, so she said that he should not be offended by the young man because he was not all right in the head. Arinda asked her friend if he was very angry. Then Reynolds looked at the lady intently and said that it was exactly like that. She sighed heavily and said that she was apologizing for him. Reynolds looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and said that it did not mean that he was angry with her. Reynolds said he thought it was his fault for trying to get her to take up fencing. He smiled and apologized. The young lady smiled and said that it was okay. He didn't need to worry about such things. She smiled and said that they would see each other more often in the future. Reynolds said with an embarrassed smile that he still thought it was too pitiful to waste such stamina. He said tenderly that it would be good if they just saw each other like this. The young lady in turn was very happy because she saw that they had become even closer to each other. She turned around and looked at her friend. Serena approached the young man with lightning speed and asked if he would like to eat with them. Luke looked at the young lady with tears in his eyes and anger and said in an angry voice that she was a traitor. The young lady in turn did not want to listen to him and with lightning speed shoved the bun into his mouth. He was furious. I didn't understand how she could leave him. A moment later, Luke asked what the young man was doing here. He looked at the young lady intently and asked if she knew that wizards were not on good terms with swordsmen. She looked away from him and asked if he thought a wizard was a wizard or a swordsman. Reynolds said that 2 of the 3 syllables in that word belonged to the word swordsman, so he assumed that he was closer to the swordsman. Luke sighed heavily as he could not understand who he had to dine with. Serena smiled and said that they didn't have any other friends. Luke said angrily that he was not friends with the young man. Arinda said with a smile that now he looked like a kid from kindergarten, and it seemed that he was offended. She was surprised because now she was sitting carefree with people with whom she had no contact before. She told them meaningless stories and shared bread. She was glad because all this happened without the participation of the prince. The young lady understood perfectly well that this was not life, but a fairy tale. The young man in turn looked sullenly at the young lady, not taking his gaze off her. She looked at him in surprise and wondered if she had gone too far, since she had no idea what his reaction was. He sighed heavily and said that it was useless for her to smile like that, since he was still angry. She looked at him in surprise and asked if that was the reason he sighed heavily, and asked if she really needed any other reason. Arinda thought for a moment, as he felt bad when she smiled. Memories from her past life came flooding back to her, as the prince had once said similar words to her. She was shocked because he had told her that it made him feel bad when she smiled. Luke looked at the young lady closely and asked with a smile if that was possible. He sighed heavily and said that this did not mean that he was no longer angry with her, because she herself should understand that it was very difficult for him when he carried out the punishment. Reynolds said that if you train hard enough, you can easily pass such a punishment. Luke looked at the young man closely and said that he seemed to be a slow thinker. Arinda pinched the young man. He was very surprised and cried out in pain. Serena looked closely at the young men and said that she had heard that the academy was having some sort of dance party on the weekends. She smiled and said it was a welcome ball for freshmen. Reynolds asked in surprise if there was any reason to organize such an event. lady said that they had been studying in the same class for several years, and they did not have the opportunity to meet with children from other groups. Arinda looked closely at the young lady, as she understood that she and the prince did not have much opportunity to meet. She knew perfectly well that the ball was a trick of the author for the sake of a dramatic meeting of the lovers. Reynolds sighed heavily and was taken aback, as he knew that they would have to dance at the celebration. Luke looked at the young man with a sneer and asked if the man who handled the ball wasn't good at that sort of thing. Reynolds looked at the young man with annoyance and said that he seemed confident. Luke said with a happy smile that it was so, because he was one of the best dancers among the wizards of the Magic Tower. Reynolds sighed heavily and said that she did not think that was something to be proud of. The lady looked closely at the young men, because as far as she remembered, both of them did not dance very well. Arinde looked at her partner and suggested that he leave too. Luke looked at the young lady and asked if she danced well. She sighed heavily and said that she was dancing to improve him. She was surprised, looked at him, so she did not understand his reaction. He asked with a smile if she had forgotten who her partner was. The young lady was irritated. She shouted at him not to call her that because she didn't want that. He smiled and said that he had helped her earlier, and now she should do him a favor in return. He smiled and asked if she would go with him to practice dancing. Sometime later, the young people were practicing dancing. She was irritated and embarrassed. She screamed that he should not step on her feet. He sighed heavily and said that it was true. He was sure that he was doing everything right. Luke asked if she was sure of her knowledge. Serena said with a smile that the young lady was saying everything correctly, and it seemed that he was the one who had poor control over his body. She smiled and said that they should try again. Arian looked at the young man in surprise and asked why he asked her to train him if he couldn't even listen to criticism. Luke smiled and said that he thought it would be fun and he had to be better than him because it was a matter of honor. He looked at the young lady with a sly smile and suddenly pulling her closer to him, said that he actually danced very well. Luke said that as a reward for today, he would teach her a unique magic from the tower, while he said that she could use this magic on some guy she hated. She sighed heavily and said that they would dance one more time. A moment later, the young lady was puzzled. She wondered if he really danced so well. She knew it was very different from the content of the novel. Luke said with a happy smile that he had told her earlier that he was a very good dancer. She knew that this could not be achieved in one day, and unless he was a genius. Luke patted the young lady on the head with a happy smile and said that she was fun to spend time with. A moment later, he used his magic and disappeared. The young girls were surprised. The young lady was puzzled, for she did not understand where it had been seen that dresses were rented in order of queue. Sorting through the outfits, she noticed that there was nothing suitable left, and they had even refused lunch and arrived early. She sighed heavily and said that if she had known it would turn out like this, she would have taken a few with her. Serena smiled and said that everything was fine and that it was the right size. A moment later, the young lady said that she had found the right outfit. She pulled out a beautiful dress from the closet with a happy smile and asked her friend to try it on. Serena asked her friend, in surprise, if she thought the dress would suit her. She smiled and said that of course the dress would suit her. Arinde knew very well that the main character wore this dress every year, and the prince, seeing her, immediately fell in love with her. Arinde thought for a moment and wondered if they should go with another option. Serena smiled and told her friend that she had already picked out a dress for her, so she would wear it. Serena looked at her friend with alarm and asked what she would do since there was nothing suitable for her in the closet. Arinde smiled and told her friend that she didn't need to worry about such things because she had already thought of everything in advance. Sometime later, the young lady made a spectacular appearance at the dance. Everyone present was shocked by her appearance because they did not understand why she was wearing a tailcoat. William looked at his sister in surprise and asked what she was wearing. The young lady greeted her brother casually. She asked in surprise if he would really interfere in her personal life, since he had not previously shown any interest in her. He was shocked and did not understand that they had taken on the appearance of a girl who had already made her debut in high society. She asked if they should not then engage in small talk. A moment later, the young lady, in accordance with all the rules of etiquette, began to make small talk with her brother. In a word, she told him to leave her alone. The young man was furious and flushed with anger. William shouted to his sister that it seemed like he would have to report everything to their father because he should have known how she behaved at the academy. The young lady said with a smirk that she had told her father the same thing before leaving. The young man was surprised by her words. A moment later, Serena approached them and greeted her friend with a joyful smile. Serena smiled and told her friend that she looked very beautiful. Arinda told the lady that she was the most beautiful girl at the banquet. Moments later, Serena saw her brother behind her friend's back. Arinde looked at her brother in bewilderment, as she did not understand what had happened to him. William looked at the young lady with a happy smile and greeted her politely, and also said that they had met her a couple of times before, and he also introduced himself. She smiled and greeted him back and said that his face seemed familiar to her, as he was the young lady's brother. He smiled and said that it seemed that she was very close to his sister, and if she had any questions about his sister, she could ask him. The young lady smiled and said that she had nothing like that. Serena looked at the young man intently and said loudly that her friend was so kind that she even apologized on his behalf. When he followed her and tried to flirt with her, she said that he always left before she could say anything to him. She looked at the young man intently and said that she found his harassment very unpleasant, so she hoped that in the future he would not do this. The young man was stunned. She smiled and said that she was very sorry that she had to listen to her friend's apologies every time because of him. She hoped that he would be so kind as to leave her alone. A moment later, they turned and walked away. Serene looked at her friend and said that she was very sorry. She was afraid that her brother might hate her later. She wondered if she should have just accepted it and accepted the young man's advances. Arinde smiled and said that she shouldn't worry about it, as she was happy with her actions. Serena looked at the young lady in surprise and asked why she had chosen such an outfit. She, of course, understood that it suited her very well, but still it was very unexpected. Arinde smiled and told her friend that it was all so that she could dance with her. The young lady laughed in response, as she did not expect such a thing. Arinde knew perfectly well that this was true, but she had another reason why she had not worn a dress. Their engagement with the prince is a well-known fact. If anyone had to dance the waltz, signifying the beginning of the ball, they would be in the front row. The young lady glanced sideways into the distance and called out to her friend. She was surprised that the prince was heading towards them. The young lady looked at her friend and asked if she could bring her some water and food. Serena politely agreed. A moment later, the crown prince approached her and said in surprise that she had a very interesting outfit. He sighed heavily and asked if she really didn't want to dance with him. That's why she did it. Arinde looked closely at the prince because she knew that everything was exactly as he said. He looked at her hard and said he didn't know why she would go that far. He reached out to her slowly and said that they would not be able to kill each other now anyway. The young lady was a little surprised and moved away from him with lightning speed. The prince said that he thought she really wanted to break off her engagement with him. He gently touched her hair and said that that was why he wanted to take this chance. She froze for a moment, not understanding what was happening. The prince said with a smile that it would be nice to demonstrate the warmth of the relationship between the royal family and the magic tower. The young lady was furious because he had just said that he was going to use her. A moment later, Luke came up to them and hugged the prince with a joyful smile. He told the prince that in that case, his target should have been him, not the young lady. He said with a smile that he agreed to take on the role of Arinda in his show. The prince was shocked and did not understand what the young man was doing. Luke, with a joyful and playful smile, said that he was now teasing the next king as the future head of the magic tower while he squeezed the young man harder. The young lady froze for a moment and looked at her friend in surprise. Luke nodded back at the young lady with a sweet smile, as his actions had helped her escape the prince. Luke smiled and said that he was amazing at one dance, and also asked the prince with a playful smile, how about they announce the start of the ball together? The prince was furious because they were guys. Luke said with a happy smile that he could even wear a dress for such an occasion. The young lady ran away from the banquet hall with tears in her eyes. She knew that Luke was a very good partner, and she hoped that he would survive after something like this. A moment later, she ran out into the street and sighed heavily. She knew that today was full of events that had never happened before. A moment later, she turned around and looked at her friend in surprise, as she did not expect to see him on the balcony. She asked why he had come out. He sighed heavily and said that unfortunately he didn't like such places. Reynolds looked away in confusion and said that inside, Luke was waltzing with the crown prince in a bizarre manner. She sighed heavily and asked if he had come out because he didn't want to see such a sight with his own eyes. Reynolds looked at the young lady intently and said that he learned to dance so as not to lose to Luke. He timidly said that he would like her to appreciate their skills. He looked at her intently and said that they could dance once she looked at him in surprise, but still agreed. A moment later, they were transported to the banquet hall and were dancing. She looked at him in surprise and asked how he trained at all. Reynolds sighed heavily and said that he had been helped by a fencing professor. A moment later, the young lady realized who was watching them so intently from the side. She sighed heavily and said that she did not know that he waltzed well. Reynolds said that the professor told him that he should dance as if he were wielding a sword. Arinde smiled tenderly and said that now she understood why he danced so aggressively. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it was strange. She said that it was not. A moment later, they finished the dance. He looked closely at the young lady and said that he must have been clumsy, as he had never been to such an event before. He thanked her with a smile for accepting his invitation to dance. The young lady was embarrassed by such a gesture. She looked at him in surprise and wondered if it was really him, because she knew very well that he was not a very smiling character. He said that it was time for him to go to bed soon. Arinda realized that it was really him. A moment later, she sighed heavily and decided to go and rest a little. She stopped when she felt the young man's intense and angry gaze on her. He looked at her with fury and indignation and asked how she could leave him and go dance with another. He shouted that it was customary to dance with a partner first. She smiled and asked if their princess hadn't already announced the start of the ballast by the crown prince. She smiled and said that she was also in a tailcoat, so if he put on a dress, she would dance with him. She always had fun teasing him. Moments later, he showed her several outfits with a happy smile and asked if he should wear something extravagant. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was her fault, so they should go on stage. Luke asked Arinda with a smile if Reynolds could dance better than him. Arinda asked the young man, in surprise, if it was possible to compare an expert with a beginner. She smiled and thanked him for helping her out, because she thought she would lose her temper, but thanks to the young man, she held back. He laughed and said that she needed to look at the expression on the prince's face and then leave. Luke smiled and said that the prince was screaming about his desire to kill him that very second. The young lady smiled and said that she had wanted to ask him something for a long time. She looked at him in surprise and asked what the real reason was for him asking them to become partners. He smiled a sly smile and asked if a reason was needed given their relationship. Arinde looked at the young man intently and said that she was asking what kind of relationship there was between them. He sighed heavily and said that she was simply heartless. She looked at him intently and said that it was true because she didn't understand who would agree to wear a dress for a man they had only known for a week. He smiled and said that it was no big deal because that was exactly his reputation. Looking away from the young lady, he asked if, since they had only known each other for a week, it meant that his feelings for her were not serious. He smiled a gentle smile and said that he liked her and that he was also interested in her as a person. She sighed heavily as she realized that she could not get anything more out of him. A moment later, he saw the nth lady and called her to them with a smile, and also asked Ariinda how about Togo to trust his partner for once. As he left, he smiled and said that they would see each other tomorrow in class. Serena ran up to the young lady like lightning, as she had just managed to find her. Arinda asked for forgiveness with a timid smile, as she was only going out for a short time, so as not to see anything unnecessary. Serena asked if she was really talking about Luke's open-back dress now. Arinde asked the lady what about the prince and how he reacted. Serena sighed heavily and said that he must have been shocked. All she knew was that he left immediately after the dance was over. The young lady was glad and understood that the prince had not met his main heroine today. She knew that in this life, she had not had a waltz-link prince, and she also understood that the young people did not meet. The young lady, in turn, was very happy, since the evening went as well as possible. Sometime later, the professor was telling her students, "History, the revival of the empire." If you ask the students who the main character of the dance evening is, there will be one answer. The first was, of course, the crown prince, who will become the temperature in the future. His other sweet bride, or rather her partner, Luke Oscar, the next head of the magic tower. He was even nicknamed the lover of the crown prince. The lady looked closely at the young man and asked with a smile if he had danced so hard yesterday that he had fallen asleep in class. All the students looked closely at the young man with some mockery. The young lady, in turn, threw a small note to her partner and asked with a smile what it was like to become the crown prince's lover. With lightning speed, the young man threw the note away. He looked at her with a threatening look and gesture, saying that he was watching her. She was surprised and looked at him, as she did not understand his reaction. Serena quietly told her friend that the professor was looking in their direction. A moment later, Madame looked intently at the young lady and called her. With a smirk, she asked the young lady what was the name of the commander of the punitive detachment of that time. She knew that she would not answer this question for the day like everyone else. A moment later, the young lady calmly answered the question posed. Madame was shocked, as she did not expect such a thing. A moment later, Madame said that the young lady had given the correct answer. She sighed heavily and continued her lecture. Serena looked at her friend in surprise and asked how she knew this, since the professor seemed to have asked the question on purpose, being sure that the young lady would not answer correctly. Arinda said with a smile that repetition is the mother of learning. She had gone through this material in her past lives. Luke looked at the young lady closely and asked if she would be training after lunch. Without looking at the young man, she asked why she would do that. He sighed heavily and, looking away from her, said that he promised to teach her a spell from the magic tower. She wondered if he was offended because she teased him. She looked at her partner intently and asked what he would teach her. Reynold looked at the lady in surprise and asked what the young man would teach her. Luke hugged the young lady with a joyful smile and said that he actually knew a little bit about swordplay too. Last time he showed her a couple of tricks, so now she asked him to teach her something new. Ariinde sighed heavily because he was joking again. Reynold looked at the young man intently and said that he no longer trusted him. Luke smiled shyly and said that he just wanted to teach her magic that would allow her to throw meteorites from the sky. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was somehow primitive. The young people wanted to know if the academy would collapse or not because of this. Luke sighed heavily and asked what their reaction was. Arindi looked at the young man intently and said that he should at least tell the truth sometimes. He said that they are independent of how often he lies. His partner must believe him. Arindi looked at him intently and asked why she should trust him now when he had not inspired any trust in the first place. He was puzzled by her words and asked the young people if they had not now taken the side of the future of the wizards. He asked if they were afraid of the future. Arinda said with a smile that she was running and stumbling, praying for forgiveness. Serena looked at her friends with a happy smile and said that they were a lot of fun. Luke looked at the young lady closely and said that she didn't have much mana, but that was no reason to participate, because today he was going to unlock her hidden potential. She was surprised, didn't understand how he was going to do it. He smiled and said that there was only one way, and they would just rescue all the mana she had. She said that she knew how to use magic, but she didn't know how to sense mana. He smiled and said that it was understandable, because only wizards of the magic tower were taught this. He looked at her intently and said that the principle was very simple, and she should imagine that all the power she possessed was concentrated in her chest. She sighed heavily and said that she had raised and would gather all her strength in the center of her chest. Luke said that she was doing everything right and should continue in the same spirit. He looked at her intently and said that even if it seemed to her that her strength was fading, she had to endure, and if anything happened, he would help her. A moment later, the young lady began the process of removing the power, but she was puzzled because she did not understand why she was so hot. Unfortunately, she felt how the strength was leaving her, and her head was empty. A moment later, the young man shouted in a hurry for her to stop. He was very scared because he thought she was coping. He was confused because he didn't understand why it happened that way. The young lady froze in shock as she saw her friend's hair. Arinde froze for a moment in surprise and shock because her hair was a completely different color. Serena rushed to her friend and asked if she was okay. She was afraid that her friend might hurt herself. Arinde smiled and said that she was fine. Only her head was ringing loudly, and her senses had become much more sensitive. Luke looked at her worriedly and said that this was very good. Arinde looked at the young men with a smile and asked if she had become a grandmother. He looked at her in surprise and asked if that was really all she was interested in such a situation. Serena looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was okay. She smiled and said that she was okay, only she was a little sleepy. A moment later, the young man picked up the young lady in his arms and told her that she needed to rest a little because she had released too many deceptions, so she was exhausted now. She was surprised because she did not expect this, but did not resist. Opening her eyes, Milady rose up with lightning speed, as she did not understand where she was. Serena looked closely at her friend and asked how she was feeling. She wanted to know if her friend was feeling unwell. Arinde was confused because she didn't understand where they were. Serena smiled and said that they were now in the medical center. Luke said that he would take care of her himself, so the doctor left. She looked at the young people in surprise and asked why everything turned out this way. Luke sighed heavily and said that her body couldn't handle the mana, so she sat for a while. Even now, her mana was still unstable, so she needed to rest. She asked in surprise, was this really the first time for everyone? Luke sighed heavily and said that her case was special because usually when the body reaches its limit, it cuts off the flow of mana, so no matter how much it increases, mana always has a limit. He looked at her intently and said that she had no limits. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really meant to say that she had an endless supply of mana. He sighed heavily and said that she was rejoicing too soon. No matter whether she had an endless supply or not, her body could not withstand a large load. He said that now her hair was affected, and then her internal organs could be affected. If her body could not cope with the load, then she would die. She was surprised because he was angry and he did not do this often. She knew that since she now knew how things would happen, next time it would be easier for her. She knew that she just needed to find a middle ground. He was shouting that she should rest first. The young lady sighed heavily because she had rested very well, but she knew that returning to lessons after a short break would be pure hell. Thanks to her partner, she was able to miss 5 whole days of school. He somehow very ugly explained to the director why she needed a rest, and then still got his consent. She was very puzzled because her long rest was over. Serena happily gave her friend notes from the lessons she had not attended. The young lady with her lightning speed rushed into her friend's arms. Arinde knew all the material very well, but was still glad that her friend helped her. A moment later, Luke will break their tight embrace as he could not bear to watch the passions since this morning. He looked at her intently and said that she should not change so abruptly, otherwise he would get scared. Arinda looked at him in surprise and said that he himself asked her to be friendlier with him. He sighed heavily and said that he remembered it. A moment later, he pulled out a small magic stone from his pocket that he had designed especially for her. Luke said that the stone would stop the flow of mana once her body reached its limit. She was surprised because she didn't know if that was possible. He smiled and asked if there was anything he couldn't do. Serena smiled happily and said that she and Luke tried very hard. Arinda was surprised and told her friend that she could have gotten hurt. Serena smiled and said that her mana had a limit, so everything was fine. She said that if something happened to her, then her friend would probably do the same. Luke froze in place of the author of the shock because he also made the stone. They chatted happily for a while, and after a few seconds, Reynolds came up to them and called her to this lady. She smiled, looking at the young man, and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Reynolds looked at her worriedly and said that he heard that she was very ill. He asked if she was okay or if everything was okay with her now. Arinde smiled and said that it was exactly like that, but she was already feeling much better. He smiled and said that it was very good, and also asked her to train more often. Then her immunity would increase. She knew that if everything continued like this, then her partner would start to dispute everything again. Luke looked at the young lady closely and said that the young man was speaking correctly. She was surprised that he agreed with the knight. He smiled and said that the body must be strong then in him, and mana more than a month, so she should concentrate on strengthening the body, and now she should train more often with the knight. She was shocked because she saw that they simply all conspired. Reynolds looked at the young lady intently and said that he was not going to put her through hard training, and she didn't need to worry. She smiled and asked if that was true. He said that it had been a while since her health had improved, so they could start with 5 laps around the stadium. The young lady froze in shock on the spot, as it was a great strain for her. Luke smiled and quietly told the young lady that he would make sure that everything was fair during the training, as it would be unwise to use magic in such a state. Arianda sighed heavily and told the young man that she had actually lied to him about something last time. Reynolds looked at her intently and said that if she was talking about using magic last time, then he already knew she was in shock since Luke had told him about it. She knew he could tell her he didn't trust her anymore, but it was the opposite. She expected something completely different, but he seemed to be worried about her. He looked at her intently and asked what she was so surprised about. She asked in surprise if he really wanted her to run a lot of laps, knowing about her condition. He looked at her closely and said that the lesson would start soon, so today they would limit themselves to 3 laps, and from tomorrow she would run from early morning, and at this rate they would be able to restore her routine very quickly. Reynolds grabbed the lady by the hand and dragged her into the stadium. She was excited and shouted that if she ran so much, she would definitely sweat. Luke smiled and shouted to her that he would take care of the smell so she could run as much as she wanted. The young lady was shocked. She realized that her partner was the same as the prince. Luke, in turn, wished her luck with a joyful smile. After a hard workout, the young lady lay helplessly on her desk. She understood perfectly well that she would not be able to complete 5 laps. Serena looked at the young lady and said that Luke told her that wizards need to exercise because their stamina will improve due to this, so she agreed with him. Ariindi looked closely at her friend and sighed heavily because she knew that she was very nice, and so she forgave her. A moment later, their class started. Madam told all her students that they had to put their books away because they had an unscheduled test today. She said that the test results would not affect the grade, and it was only necessary to evaluate their level, so they should not worry. The young lady, in turn, understood that this task was impossible for those who had just entered the academy. She did not think that the guys had a good chance. She wondered how she would write the test But a moment later she remembered that she was going to be part of the magic tower in the future. She realized that she needed to try to write the test as well as possible. The next day, Madame called the young lady and her partner and said that since she was the daughter of a duke's family, she was not going to let such a thing go unpunished. The madam was furious and shouted at the young lady that she should have a conscience and confess everything herself. Arinde looked at the professor and said that she did not understand what she was talking about. Madame looked at her with a dull expression and asked if she was really going to continue pretending. Arinde looked at Madame with irritation and said that if it was because of yesterday's test, then she didn't cheat. Madame said that since the young lady realized that she was talking about the test, then she did something wrong. Arinde looked at her in surprise and asked if she was trying to corner her. She said that she only gave this information out of consideration, that as a professor who was not in charge of their class, she had no need to scold her except for yesterday's test. Madame looked at her intently and said that she had more than enough confidence. Arinde said that the one who is truly guilty must repent. Luke smiled and quietly told the young lady that as he thought her character was still there. Madame looked at them intently and said that no one could know the correct answer except Luke. She didn't know how she could help but doubt since the young lady had barely passed her entrance exams. The young lady looked closely at the results real Arinde had received. Even before she was transferred to the villainess's body, she understood that the young lady was a terrible student, and she couldn't understand how she had even managed to get into the academy. Madame looked at the young lady intently and said that the young man had accepted her as a partner, and only he could know the answer, so she copied from him. Arinde said that if she had cheated, she would have been caught immediately because Madame used magic to find offenders. The young lady quietly called her partner and said that he had to say something. A moment later, the young man began to justify himself and tell his reasons. The young lady was shocked because he was talking nonsense. The lady sighed heavily and asked the young man if he was really trying to justify his actions with logic. She said that this would not work and she needed real evidence. The young lady shouted that she could take the test again. A moment later, the prince entered their office and said that it seemed his bride was in trouble. Madame was shocked because she did not understand why the principal came to them. The guy said that it seemed to him that Madame was scolding his bride, so he decided to see what was going on. He asked if he could help Madame make sure of the young lady's innocence. Adam said that he could do it. The prince said that he knew that the young lady had been studying magic on her own after entering the academy. He said that she had a very strong talent, and he also personally saw her use a paralyzing spell. Madame screamed furiously, "I will bring that there is a possibility that he is lying to protect his bride." He looked at her intently and said that he could swear on the name of the emperor. For a moment there was dead silence in the audience. This oath could only be taken by members of the imperial family. If a person lied while taking this oath, he would die from pain shock. Therefore, the truth of the prince's words is undeniable. Otherwise, he would be writhing in agony right now. The madam looked at the young lady intently and said that since she had used such a powerful spell, it was proof of her strength. She apologized for the unfounded accusations. She said that they could settle for the young lady taking the test again after school. The young lady was shocked because she did not want to admit it, but the prince helped her. Walking down the corridor, Luke sighed heavily and said that his dinner was crying quietly to the side. Arinde looked at the young man and said that they could go shopping. Then she said that the lunch would be on her account and he should go first. Luke looked at her in surprise and asked what about her. She said that she would catch up with him later because she needed to talk to the prince. He sighed heavily and suddenly hugged the young lady and said that he would stay with her. Arinde thanked him, but said that she would manage without him because he would only get in the way. The young lady looked at the prince intently and said that every day she prayed for him to die, but it didn't happen. Noah looked at her in surprise and said that it seemed like some kind of twisted way of saying thank you to the one who helped her. She said that it was his will, and she didn't have to thank him for it. He sighed heavily and asked what she wanted to talk to him about. Then, Arinde sighed heavily and said that she thought that if she immediately named the reason, he would not even listen to her. The lady looked closely at the princess and said that it seemed he had already guessed something like this, so she would not beat around the bush. She looked at the prince with a joyful smile and said that they could break off their engagement. He looked at her in surprise and asked why he would do that. The prince said that their engagement was an important step towards improving the relationship between the imperial family and the magic tower, and he could not miss the chance that only a race could give in life. She sighed heavily and said that this was the line of a real villain. The lady said that she did not expect more because his character is simply disgusting. The prince said that he thought she was not in a position to judge others. She looked at the princess with a smile, said that he could have gotten closer to Luke then because they had even managed to dance. Noah sighed and said that the young man hated him, and the ice was in shock. She screamed that it seemed he had forgotten, so she would repeat to him once again that she hated him more than anyone in the world. She screamed that all the hatred of people would not be enough to convey it. The prince sighed heavily and said that this was very strange. He looked at the young lady intently and quoted her words about how she was happy to be able to attend the academy with him. She froze for a moment, and he told her that she had written that in her letter before she entered. The prince approached the young lady with lightning speed and said that she definitely liked him. She froze for a moment, not knowing what to answer. Arinde looked at the prince intently and said that human feelings are very fickle, and besides, he had done nothing for her all this time. The prince looked at the young lady intently, but did not answer, and now she realized that he had not even bothered to answer that letter. A moment later, she sighed heavily and said that she was not going to remain his fiancée, and she was no longer going to be a pawn to improve the relationship between the imperial palace and the magic tower. She said that if he did not agree to break off the engagement quietly, she would destroy Maleficent's family with her own hands. Arinde said irritably that if he didn't break the help, then she would leave the magic tower for a while and kill him. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she would change her mind. She screamed that there was no way that would happen. As she was leaving, the young lady said that she really hoped he would make the right choice, so he should think it over carefully. Some time later, the young ladies were sitting and discussing the situation. Serena looked at the young lady closely and said that the professor had gone a bit overboard anyway. Arinde decided to let the matter go and asked where Reynold was now, since she had not seen him. A moment later, the young man came up to her with lightning speed and said with a smile that he was here. She looked at him closely and said with a smile that it looked like he had come in after his lunchtime workout today. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback and froze for a moment as she saw her partner. Luke used magic with lightning speed and helped the young knight cool down a little. Reynold looked at the young man in surprise and asked why he was suddenly so concerned about his side. Luke sighed heavily and said that he owed the young lady for bread. Sometime later, they again started talking about the professor's injustice towards the young lady. Serena knew that her friend had to stay and retake the test. Arinde smiled and said that the most important thing was that she was able to clear her name. Serena smiled and said that her kindness knows no bounds. Arinde smiled and said that she also wanted to say something about her friend. Luke sighed heavily, as he knew that not a day went by without this. The young lady looked closely at the knight and said that she had one request for him. She looked at him with confidence and said that she really wanted to learn fencing. She understood that if she learned magic from her partner and fencing from the knight, the prince would not dare to touch her with a finger, so she just wanted to stand up for herself. Reynold asked the young lady if she wanted to learn basic self-defense skills. He was interested in whether she wanted to master the sword to a level that would allow her to win battles. Arinde looked at the young man intently and said that she wanted a level of skill so high that she could compare it to the imperial family's skills. Reynolds looked at her closely and said that in that case the training would be extremely intense and she couldn't relax. She smiled and said that of course she would do everything she knew perfectly well, that she would definitely cope with the task. But after a while, she, panting with fatigue, said that she was giving up. Reynolds informed the young lady that the time was not up yet. She sighed heavily and said that she felt like she was going to fall soon. He looked at her closely and in all seriousness said that at that time it was not yet time, and she should continue training. Some time later, he informed the young lady that they were done for the day, and she fell to the ground with a joyful smile, helpless. He looked at her intently and said in all seriousness that she shouldn't lie down right after a hard workout and that she should do some simple exercises to relax her body. She sighed heavily and said that this was too much. He said that he had warned her in advance that there would be no concessions. Arinde sighed heavily and said that she would only take a few minutes for a break. She couldn't understand how he could be so heartless. She said that she had only recently recovered from an illness. Reynolds looked at her intently and started talking about Luke. She sighed heavily and said that her partner probably didn't think the training would be so intense. Reynolds sighed heavily and looking at the young lady said that he had never taught anyone, so he based his training on his own. He asked for forgiveness because he felt that he had overestimated her capabilities. She saw before her a truly handsome young man with a beautiful body who was in a helpless state. She considered this a small victory. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed like he had overdone the training, so today he would be carrying her on his back. The young lady was shocked because she didn't expect this. She was puzzled because she did not understand how they came to this. He said that they needed to improve her diet because she was too light compared to her peers. Returning to the dorm, he said that she should definitely wash herself before going to bed. The young lady sighed heavily, but still agreed. The young man smiled and glanced sideways at the young lady as she hugged him tenderly. A month has passed since entering the academy. The main character and the prince have not crossed paths. Arinde has freed herself from the shackles of the plot in the original story, which she thought would never change. She could not know when the main events would begin, but she learned that this time he would not kill her so easily. She understood perfectly well that death could come in other ways. She could die from illness or from an accident. The young lady looked at her friend in surprise and asked why she didn't come into the office. Arinde sighed heavily and said that she simply remembered how fleeting human life is. Serena smiled and said that it seemed that was why people tried so hard to succeed in life. She told her friend that if she thought that she could die at any moment and there was no point in doing anything, she could change that. Serena smiled and told her friend that she was not one of those people who would give up right away. Arinde, having been reborn, this time decided not to be idle, but to do whatever she wanted in order to die without regrets. Now that she had emerged from the shadow of death, what worried him most was that she would die again someday. It seemed to her that death had shaken her psyche greatly. With the speed of lightning, she rushed to her friend and shouted that she should concentrate on her studies. Luke looked at them in surprise and asked if they really needed something like this in the morning. Serena asked Luke if he had studied history diligently because today was the exam. Arinde sighed heavily because she knew that he didn't care about it and she envied him. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. Arinde sighed heavily and said that his career was already determined. He always looked at her with skill and said that hers too. Arinde said that she could be fired at any moment and he was a potential head of the magic tower. She sighed and said that about her earlier because she occupied the lowest position. He smiled and said that she was his partner, so no one would dare fire her. Luke took her hand with a smile and said that he had worked so hard to find a partner so he would not leave her. She looked at him in surprise and asked what criteria he used to choose a partner. He said that he chose a person who could make him laugh because she was very funny. As she entered the office, she sighed heavily and said that it was very strange. A moment later, everyone looked closely at the young people. The young lady sighed heavily and looked closely at everyone present, as she felt like they were paying too much attention to her. A moment later, Ginny Clinton, a lady, came up and said that she wanted to ask her something. Ginny said that she would like to invite the young lady to her study group. Arindi was surprised because she did not expect this. Ginny told the lady that she had done a great job with this task last time, and that she had answered the professor's questions well. She said that she had entered the academy on a scholarship, and that the other guys were no slouch either, and that they would not drag the young lady down. She said that there are also guys from Class C in the group, so exchanging information will definitely help with their studies. Ginny smiled and said, young lady, that her fiancé was also considering joining their group. The young lady's face changed when she heard about her fiancé, and asking for forgiveness, said that it seemed she would not be able to join their group. Ginny was surprised by the refusal and asked the young lady if she could find out the reason. She thought for a moment because she didn't want to lose her friend, and she didn't want to go to the group where her groom would be waiting for her. She knew that the young lady was from a count's family, and her mentioning the titles of the boys in conversation, even inviting the crown prince, may have looked like a study group, but in reality it was a gathering of upper-class students. She smiled and thanked her lady for the offer she had given her, but also said that she and the boys had already agreed to study together. The young lady was a little surprised and upset. Serena looked at her friend closely and said with a smile that she heard her conversation, and also asked how about actually trying it. Arindi looked at her friend in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady had a radiant smile and said that she was talking about the study group. Arinda was puzzled because when her friend used such a killer smile, she could not refuse. Sometime later, the young men were discussing that the young lady had received an A on her test. The young man said that he had heard the history professor say this to a colleague when he looked into the office. They were surprised. They all knew that the young lady's grades when she entered were bad. They assumed that she had cheated somehow. Arinda sighed heavily while drinking water, since she had heard everything. She looked at her friend intently and said that she shouldn't worry about what the young men said. She said with a smile that loneliness is the fate of the best, Serena. Looking at her friend, she said with a smile that she is very cool. A moment later, the young man looked closely at the young lady and asked how she was feeling today. Arinde smiled and said that she tolerates him after training and does not fall. She smiled and asked him if he thought her stamina had improved too. He smiled and said that it had. Reynolds looked at her closely and said that there was something more important, since she had been putting a lot of strain on her body lately. So now she had to watch her sleep schedule. She smiled and asked if that was the case. Then how about reducing the intensity of her workouts? The young man ignored her question and said that it was already time for dinner, and also asked if the school cafeteria was open now. The young lady looked at him closely, following the gentle smile on his face, as she realized that he too sometimes evaded the answer. She looked closely at her friends as she realized that her place was here. Reynolds looked at the young lady closely and said that she should not give her salad to her friend. She sighed heavily and said that she would think about it. Serena looked at the young men with a smile and said that she had decided that she would not eat the salad that her friend would give her. Arinde looked at her friend in surprise and asked what she was looking at so intently. She looked back and froze for a moment, as she was very surprised. She looked closely at her brother, who was next to the prince. She was confused and did not understand why they were together. At the same time, the young man greeted his sister with a smile. She sighed heavily and turned around, telling her friends that they shouldn't look in their direction and should just ignore them. Reynolds grabbed the young lady by the arm and asked if those young men were bothering her. He said that if they were, she could just tell him. She smiled and asked if he would really beat her and them for her. She understood that it would not end with just an exception for them, and for this he could be executed. He looked at the young lady intently and said that if she wanted it, he would do it. As she left, she smiled and said that he didn't need to do that. He was surprised he didn't understand why she was saying that. She sighed heavily and said that one of them was her brother and the other was the groom. The young man froze in surprise when she mentioned the groom. She looked at the young man intently and said that she was going to break off the engagement before graduation, and she also wanted to break off contact with her family. She looked at him intently and said that he seemed to be in great shock because he was even speechless. Looking away from the young league, he said that it was nothing like that because she had just imagined it. A moment later, the young man approached his sister and, sighing heavily, said that it was very difficult to see her. She understood that this was just an excuse. He came to her in order to see the main character. She looked at him intently and said that she had to work hard not to see him too often. She asked who it was that she had not been able to meet. He looked at her with cold fury and asked if she had really lost her fear. She looked at her brother with a smirk, as she knew that he could search the entire hall but not find the main character. He was a little puzzled, as he really wanted to meet her. Arinde thought with a smile that sometimes her partner was so good and useful that she was even ready to tolerate him for the rest of her life. She was proud that her partner had magic, since he had helped her many times. William, looking at his sister, said that he had already heard everything from the prince, because he said that she wanted to break off the engagement. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed like the prince did not keep his mouth shut. William told his sister to watch her words, since she was the future empress, and therefore she should be able to find an approach to everyone. He sighed heavily and said that he did not know what had made her so angry, but the prince would like to convince her otherwise. William told his sister that the prince wanted to talk to her when she cooled down. The young lady was a little puzzled by this statement. He looked at his sister intently before leaving and said that she was no longer at the age to act like a child. William looked at her intently and said that breaking off the engagement was not something that was given to her to decide. The young lady was furious. She was shocked because the man who wanted to break off the engagement at all costs was going to make every effort to convince her otherwise. She knew perfectly well that this simply couldn't be. The young lady froze in shock when she opened the door and saw a whole mountain of gifts. The prince sighed heavily and, looking intently at the young lady, said that he did not know what she would like, so he was guided by his own taste. He said that William said that girls like such things. She sighed heavily and told the prince that he agreed with her brother in stupid ideas. She sighed heavily and asked if he felt sorry for the people who paid taxes to a man like him. The prince smiled and said that this was the people's investment in the country's future. He said that if she changed her mind, the imperial family would only benefit. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't like him, and she didn't like the gifts either. She asked him to take them all and get out of her sight. He was puzzled because he didn't know what she was angry about. He asked if it was because he had neglected her in the past. The prince asked for forgiveness. He looked at her intently and asked her forgiveness for threatening to execute her last time. He said that he didn't know then that she would be so useful, so he made a mistake. Ariinda looked at the prince puzzled and wondered if he even heard what she was saying. It seemed to her that his ears were tuned to hear and completely ignore everything else. Ariinde said that she did not intend to listen to him, so he should leave. Noah did not let the young lady close the door and said that he was not finished yet, and if she slammed the door now, then in the morning, the mountain of gifts would be bigger. The young lady in turn laughed wildly. A moment later, she said that it didn't matter anymore. With the speed of lightning, she looked at him with an evil look, and using her magic, she said that she would burn everything to the ground. The prince was shocked, as he did not expect such a thing. He was taken aback as he realized that it didn't matter when he saw the appearance of the young lady. The prince was shocked and shouted that her hair had changed color. She sighed heavily and looked closely at her hair, as she was puzzled and wondered how unstable her body was, that her hair had turned gray from such a weak display of her power. She looked at the prince intently and said that he must leave, although if he wanted to stay, he would burn alive. The prince froze for a moment in shock. A moment later, she turned around and froze in place as she saw her partner screaming and calling her name. With lightning speed, Luke put out all the fire that was on the floor. He looked at her with alarm and shouted that he had told her earlier not to use magic. He wanted to know if she was in pain anywhere. She sighed heavily and said that she was not in pain anywhere. She looked at the young man closely and said that the dorm manager would be on the floor soon, and he might be mistaken for an accomplice, so he should leave. Luke was alarmed and didn't understand why she used magic at all. The lady said that the prince had enraged her with his gifts, so she used magic. A moment later, she staggered and fell with a crash onto her partner. A few seconds later, the head of the dormitory burst into their floor. She was shocked and did not understand what had happened. Luke smiled and, asking for forgiveness, said that he had miscalculated his strength. Madame was furious. She shouted that he should write an explanatory note. Sometime later, they were sitting in the library and studying their lessons. Lady sighed heavily and told her partner that he did it in vain because he just took her as a partner out of interest, so he did not need to take such care of her. He asked in surprise if he was supposed to say it was her fault when she was unconscious. She knew perfectly well that he would have done exactly the same in the original story. She sighed heavily and, looking at the young man, said that next time he should not do something like that because all she did was receive from him, and now she felt like a debtor. He smiled and said that everything was fine. He said with a sly smile that he was going to get it all back later. She smiled and said that coming from his lips, it sounded like a blood-curdling statement. Serena looked at the young people closely and said that they should concentrate as it was study time. Luke looked at everyone present with a smile and said that he was not hinting at anyone, but there was only one person here who needed these classes. Reynolds slowly pushed the book towards the young lady and asked her to look at one question. Arinde looked at the young man with a smile, as it seemed to her that he had decided to become a master of sports in ignoring Luke. It was difficult for her to judge any of the guys based on the original story. The hidden sides of the guys were already slowly being revealed. She knew that perhaps the fact that the guys liked the main character would soon even come to light. She really wanted Reynolds to fall in love with Serena, since he had the power to make her life happy. Arinde smiled and said that she thought the young lady knew the question better. Serena looked at the young man with a smile and asked what question interested him. Arinde looked at the young people. She wanted them to talk to each other. She knew that the young man was very good, and she could trust him with her most intimate things. Luke quietly asked the young lady if she wanted to run away. He said that she already knew all this, and so they could spend their time wisely learning how to control mana. He also noticed that she was trying to lead the young people on. Luke smiled and said that if they left them alone, the chances would only increase. The young lady thought for a moment as she realized that he was very advanced in this. A moment later, she nodded and agreed with him. The young people looked at them in surprise as they saw a glow from magic. They looked at them in bewilderment. Luke, with a sly smile, said that it was time for them to leave. A moment later, with the help of magic, the young people were transported to the library. The young lady sighed heavily and said that her friend would be angry. She knew that her friend was kind, but because of this, she could be convinced. She told her partner that he was just a snake and a tempter because he persuaded her. Luke looked at the young lady in surprise and said that she was usually very brave, but for some reason she was timid when it came to her friend. She smiled and said that she liked the young lady very much, and it was natural to feel at a loss in front of the person you liked. Luke smiled and asked what about her fiancé, since he was currently crazy about her. The young lady was furious at his question and asked with a smile if she should hit him. Luke looked at his friend in surprise and asked what was so special about the young lady. Arinde smiled and said that her friend was very beautiful and kind. He sighed heavily and said that there were many such people in this world. She smiled and said that no one could compare to her. He looked at her intently and said that she was wrong. Luke walked up to the young lady with a smile and said that there was a girl and she was right in front of him now. The young lady froze for a moment in shock and surprise. He smiled slyly at her and said that she was beautiful too. She was shocked, didn't understand what was happening, and wondered if he had eaten something wrong. She sighed heavily and said that it wasn't so, and she couldn't compare to her friend. Luke couldn't help but laugh wildly. She sighed heavily as she realized that he was just trying to make fun of her. She glared at him and told him to stop making fun of her, and also asked why he didn't just continue to stick to the goal, since they had decided to avoid it. He smiled and said that he wasn't joking. A moment later, the young man came closer to her and stroked her head with a smile. She was shocked and asked what he was even doing, since he had tangled all her hair. Luke slowly walked closer to her and said that the mana had stabilized sooner than he expected. He stroked her head tenderly again and said that now they could train hard. He smiled and said that she should continue to work hard, and if she learned everything, it would be very useful to her in the future, because he really wanted to have a capable subordinate. She smiled and said that he could rest assured. Ariand looked at the young man intently and asked how he knew she was using high-level magic when they first met. Before the story began, the young lady had low grades in her entrance exams and didn't even know how to use magic. The young lady only realized this after returning back several times. She didn't understand how the young man knew about this. He said that he felt a flow of mana in her body that was different from the newcomer. Luke looked at her closely and said that usually people who didn't have magic had minor in both magnitude and mana flow, but she was different from them, as she had at least the flow of an academy graduate. He smiled and said that the way she stood up to the crown prince was very funny. She sighed heavily and said that if this was really the reason why he took her as his partner, then the result of his choice was really insignificant. He smiled and asked how it was insignificant, because thanks to her, his life had become very interesting lately. He smiled and said that for such fun, it would be nice to even continue cleaning the corridors in the future. The young lady was a little puzzled and embarrassed. She told her partner that she could put the necklace on herself. He smiled and said that he had already done everything. She was puzzled because she knew the atmosphere between them was strange, but he did other things too. He smiled and said that they could do what you planned to do last time. He said that this time everything would be very good. She didn't need to worry. She looked at the young man intently and said with a smile that they could begin then. A moment later, the young lady began to concentrate her mana. Luke looked at her carefully, not taking his eyes off her. Studying her every move, he told her that she should act slowly. Luke looked at her closely and said that she should do it a little longer. But a moment later, he was taken aback and cried out as he saw that she was losing consciousness. With lightning speed, he cast magic on the young lady. He looked at the young lady with a happy smile and said that she had done a very good job. Pulling her cheeks, he said with a smile that she did well for coping. The young lady smiled radiantly in response. Luke froze for a moment in surprise and embarrassment as he was taken aback by her smile. A moment later, they heard the bell ring, the young lady saying that it was time for them to go back. They slowly took each other's hands. He looked at her intently, as he remembered that she had said that it was natural to feel lost in front of the person you liked. He sighed heavily, as now he seemed to understand what she was talking about. Arinda looked at her friend closely and said that she seemed to be very angry. She smiled shyly and said that she should not have given in to the young man's speech. She sighed heavily and said that she was just trash, that no one needed. The lady was shocked by such words of her friend. She sighed heavily and said that she was really upset because they had run away and left her alone with the young man. She was puzzled by the fact that she still felt uncomfortable being alone with him. Arinda smiled and said that next time she would never do that. She swore with Luke's wrist. A few seconds later, Luke approached the young lady and asked why she suddenly lost his wrist in their conversation. Luke looked at the young lady closely and asked why she was still angry. He said that they had more important things to do than study, because they already knew all the material, and the young lady also agreed with him. He looked at her intently and asked why she was silent. Arinda was taken aback, not knowing what to answer. Luke said that she definitely wanted the young people to be alone. She, with the speed of lightning, shut his mouth. The young lady looked at the young man with fury, as she wanted him to shut his mouth and not talk about such things, because if her friend found out about such things, she would not speak to her for several days. Arinde smiled and said that thanks to this, they made something 100 times more productive. Place of study. Serena looked at them in surprise and asked what they were talking about. Luke smiled and said that the young lady's mana had completely stabilized, and she had now found a suitable level that would not harm her body. Serena asked her friend with a happy smile if she would no longer faint. She wanted to know if she would still have her old hair color. Luke slowly walked up to the young lady and said that the time changes would only occur if she used magic that had reached its limit. He looked at her intently and said that as soon as the magic stopped, everything would go back to normal. He glanced sideways at everyone present as they kept their eyes on the young people. A moment later, he handed her her small necklace and said that he had injected her with the amount of mana. As long as she wore the necklace, she would not go beyond the limit. Serena said with a smile that she would put the necklace on the young lady. She looked at the young man intently and asked how much her mana limit had increased compared to before. Looking back, he asked the young lady if he could say it here. She saw nothing wrong with the question and said that he could just say it here. He looked at her intently and agreed. Everyone looked at the young people waiting for an answer. He said that unfortunately there is not that much of it. Luke sighed heavily and said that if she raised her level to the limit, she would be about the same level as the lowest-ranking mage in the Imperial family. Serena was a little puzzled because she knew that it was not that much. He sighed heavily and said that by his standards, it was not that much. Luke said that in her case, her body had no limits, so her ultimate capabilities increased several times compared to other people. She looked at him closely and said that he didn't have to bother with specific examples. He smiled and asked if she meant that he was very kind. She didn't understand why he smiled at her so sincerely. Luke looked at everyone present and said that the lesson was about to start and they should get rid of their unnecessary curiosity and start preparing for the lesson. He quietly approached her and whispered that he was not a wizard of the Imperial family, but a wizard of the Magic Tower. He quietly said that she had a fairly high level among all of them. She was surprised, did not understand why he had said completely different words before. He smiled and said that if he hadn't reported it right away, it would have caused her unnecessary trouble. She sighed heavily and asked if he thought she had enough of them now. He sighed heavily and said that he hated anything that caused trouble. A moment later, he grabbed the book and looked intently at the young lady. She looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he wanted to tell her. Serena looked at them and said that it was very strange. Arinda looked at her with bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. She looked at the young man intently and said that it was not that important. The story of her magical abilities spread throughout the academy. The young man approached the lady with a smile and said that he wanted to ask her something. Luke sighed heavily and looked closely at everyone present. A moment later, he used his magic and created a small dome that protected them from outsiders. Luke said that no one but them would be able to pass through the barrier. The young lady looked closely at her partner and asked him with a smile what he thought about this situation. He sighed heavily and said that ordinary people live such a simple life. He said that if he had known that it would be like this, he would have simply said that she had the level of an academy graduate. Reynolds looked at the young lady closely and said that it was difficult to talk to her these days. She sighed heavily, as she knew that they couldn't even study properly. The young lady sighed heavily and told her friend that she felt as if she had been kidnapped. Reynolds looked at the young lady intently and said that recently when he was training, young people would sometimes come to him. Now he understood what the reason was. The young lady realized that the situation was quite serious. Luke sighed heavily and said that his misjudgments had caused the young lady a lot of trouble. Reynold asked the young men in surprise what they were talking about. Serena said that Luke had mentioned to the boys that the young lady's mana was comparable to that of the imperial family's wizard. He looked at them in surprise, not understanding what this meant. She smiled and said that it was the same as saying that her swordsmanship skills were on par with the knights of the imperial family. Reynold froze in shock for a moment. The young lady sighed heavily, and she knew that he understood everything at once. Reynold looked at his friend with a smile and said that she was a much greater person than he had imagined. Luke looked at the young man in surprise and asked what about him. Reynold casually told the young man that he was not interested in him. Luke sighed heavily and said that for this reason he did not like swordsmen. Reynold looked at the young lady and said that since she had outstanding abilities in magic, it would be worthwhile to bring her fencing skills to the same level. The young lady was shocked by his statement and shouted that she did not need it. She knew perfectly well that he was just a fool who knew nothing but fencing, a typical secondary hero who didn't care about the opinions of others and gave priority to his own thoughts, a person who had to see things through to the end. In simple words, he was a stubborn ram. At one of the training sessions, a young lady with tears in her eyes told her coach that of course she liked him, but she thought it was wrong. He said that if she talked, everything would be more difficult. She was shocked and screamed that he was just heartless. She was shocked, wondering what kind of wealth and fame she was doing all this for, because in the original story, he told her that the main character would protect her all her life, and now he made her run with sandbags around her feet. She understood that a friend and a lover were two different things, but she was still alarmed by the fact that her friend felt uncomfortable around the young man. She wondered what he thought about her friend. She sighed heavily, as she knew that if only she could read other people's emotions, the problem would be solved. The young lady knew that right now, her friend was unable to determine who liked her, since she could read emotions in detail shortly before graduating from the academy. A moment later, the young man shouted and called the young lady, and with lightning speed he grabbed her as she was about to fall. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was so deep in thought that she didn't even hear him calling her. She thanked him. He sighed heavily and said that they could take a little rest. He looked at her intently and asked why she was laughing. She smiled and said that she simply realized that he too was human. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. Arinde smiled and said that he always looked calm while running, but looking at him now, she saw that he was covered in smog. The young lady slowly reached into her pocket for the handkerchief that Serena had given her earlier. A moment later, she said that she was going to the handkerchief and informed him that, alas, she was rubbing it. The young man froze for a moment, as he did not expect such a thing. Reynolds said he could wipe it on his sleeve, and it would be all right. She sighed heavily and said that he had removed the entire sandbag from her earlier, so she wanted to help him. He asked in surprise if she really always had a handkerchief ready. She smiled and said that was exactly the case, since her friend had recently given it to her. Then the young lady said that there was an exam soon, and she would not be able to go to the pigs for training, so she handed her handkerchief to her. Arinde smiled and told the young man that he knew how kind the young lady was, but she still woke her up every morning so that she would not be late. He smiled and said that it seemed like she liked to sleep in the morning. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, but still said that she liked it. They chatted casually for a while, and after a few minutes, the young lady said that the last time she and her partner had run away and left them alone, she had been very angry. Arinde smiled and said that even after hearing that Serena had stabilized, she immediately congratulated her. He sighed heavily and said that it was wrong to leave them alone. The young lady was taken aback and timidly said that her friend was very kind. He sighed heavily and said that he knew she was a really good person, but in any case, he was sure that she had done wrong last time. The young lady was puzzled because she did not understand why the conversation continued the idea in a different direction. She smiled and said that she knew. But in any case, her friend was one of those people who simply could not help but be liked. He looked at her closely and said that everything was right, and that her Naledi was one of those people that everyone liked. Arinda beamed with joy because he understood her. Reynolds smiled and said that a good person attracts good people. He looked at her intently and said that she was also good. The young lady froze in surprise for a moment. He sighed heavily and told the young lady that he knew his feelings best, so she didn't need to try to free him with anyone. She sighed heavily, but still agreed. She wondered if he meant that he already liked the main character, and she shouldn't worry, or that he had feelings for someone else, and she shouldn't interfere. Sometime later, they were returning back. The young lady was absorbed in her thoughts because she knew that if she went through all the connections of the young man in the novel, then in the end, there was only one person left. She was puzzled because she realized that it was she. There are many stories of the heroine being brought into the novel as a supporting character, and unexpectedly, the main characters of the novel fall in love with her. She understood that there was no guarantee that this would apply to her situation. But in turn, she was worried and wondered if it was okay to be loved by the main characters while being a villain. She knew that none of this concerned her. A moment later, the young man asked her what she was thinking about so hard. The young lady was taken aback and threw all her thoughts away. Looking at her companion, she said with a smile that she had not thought of anything. He said that it was not scary when they were together, but when she was alone, it was better to stop for a while to think because she could fall and get hurt. Arinda, looking at her friend, she asked what was being cooked for dinner today. He smiled and said that he heard there would be steak for dinner. She was surprised as he knew the menu, which even she was not aware of. He smiled and said he just knew she would ask. She was puzzled and at the same time confused as he said such phrases. She wondered if he considered her a friend. She knew that if he did, she should end it right away. She didn't know if she should ask him directly. The young man looked at her with concern and asked what had happened. The young lady said that nothing had happened and they could move on. She was worried because she knew that her priority was, of course, her friend's feelings. A moment later, the prince came up to her and called out. She was taken aback and screamed as he had frightened her. He looked at her intently and asked if she was coming to dinner. She was shocked, as she obviously showed him her hatred, and he continued to behave in this way. She shouted angrily at the prince that she had told him earlier not to appear. Reynolds blocked the young lady with his body and asked the prince what he wanted. The prince sighed heavily and said that last time it was Luke, but now it was a different person. She understood that she would not die since she had protection, but for her friend such actions were dangerous. She looked at her friend closely and said that it was her business, and he did not need to interfere. He was a little alarmed, but the young lady said that she appreciated his desire to help, but for now she would like to deal with it herself. Arinda looked at the prince intently and said casually that she was going to eat, but because of someone she had completely lost her appetite. The prince sighed heavily and said that her manner of speech remained the same. She said that his impudence remained the same. Earlier, she asked him not to try to look at her. He sighed heavily and said that she has a fiancé in general. He said that she would be better off abstaining from contact with the opposite sex. Arinda looked at Noah with cold fury and said that he could lose his life when he graduated. She asked if he shouldn't cherish his only life. The prince said that this time he really came because he wanted to talk to her, so he hoped that she would be able to give him an honest answer. She looked at the accepted one intently, not knowing what that expression was. He looked at her intently and said that not long ago, she had definitely liked him. Noah said that he knew about it because it was written in the last letter she sent him. The young lady looked sideways at her companion because she understood that she was in trouble. He said there must have been a reason why she hated him. He wanted to know what that reason was. She wondered if he would believe her if she told him everything. The death she had already experienced, the future destroyed. She accepted that he would hardly be able to understand it. She understood that she was in reality, and did not want to bury the feelings that she felt earlier. She looked closely at the prince and said that her answer was the same because she simply hated him, and therefore she could not tell him anything except these words. A moment later, she told her friend that it was time for them to leave. The prince looked after the young lady and said that he would wait, not just because they were in a marriage of convenience. The young lady turned around and screamed angrily at him to shut his mouth. She didn't want to hear any more words from his mouth. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that he was really curious about her. She was puzzled because she did not want to find herself in such a situation with him. The story of how after returning the main character falls in love with the man who killed her is quite common. She sees how he has changed and sincerely forgives him. But still, this is only possible when there are still loving feelings for this person. But the young lady knew that unfortunately, there was nothing like that between her and the prince. She was surprised and discouraged because she did not understand why he was telling her such words. The same man, in the same way, killed her several times. She wondered if she should put an end to this hatred, because the reality and the plot of the novel were different. She did not want to forgive him, as she had goosebumps at the sight of the prince, and she was disgusted. She didn't know about other people, but she didn't want the prince to show interest in her. She knew he killed her, and until recently, he tried to kill her too. The young lady was well aware that if she had not changed her life, he would have killed her this time too. She wondered if a person's essence could change in an instant. The young lady muttered quietly that he was a crazy idiot. The prince froze in place, in surprise as he heard her. She understood that people don't just change like that. The past she went through was, after all, a result of the prince's character. She looked at him intently and asked if he had gone mad. The prince was surprised by her words because he did not understand why she thought so. He asked if it was because he said last time that he would execute her. He said that if that was the case, then he should be the one who was angry, since it was she who started it. He looked at her intently and said that no matter how much he thought about it, he could not understand it because the feeling she had for him was more like hatred. He was shocked and did not understand what he had done to her. The prince asked if it was because he didn't want to break off the engagement. He wanted to know if it was because he had neglected her all this time. He asked if she hated the way he was behaving now. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that there was nothing wrong with knowing how to use your trump card. He knew that their relationship had been like this from the beginning. She knew that he had not said anything right, and it was natural that he could not understand this situation. It was she who flared up knowing the whole situation very well. She knew that now the story had changed, so she wondered if she should stop hating the prince. The prince looked at the young lady excitedly and shouted. She was puzzled because she felt like she was going to throw up. She didn't understand how even he had managed to get so close. She sighed heavily as her chest tightened with the desire to defeat. She was in a panic and wanted to run away as soon as possible. A moment later, she heard her friend's voice, Luke, with tenderness, and his opinion called the young lady. He looked at her intently and, holding out his hand, said that it was time for them to go. A moment later, they were transported into a small garden. Luke looked at her closely and said that it looked like she hadn't eaten anything. He said that she should sit for a while, and he would be back soon. A moment later, she noticed that he had used his magic and disappeared. A few seconds later, he returned to her with a small gift. She asked, alarmed, how he knew she was there. Luke looked at her intently and said that it was because her mana waves were unusual. She was surprised that he felt mana from such a distance. Arinde asked if he had taken her, knowing what the situation was. He sighed heavily and said it wasn't that easy. He knew she wanted to get out. A moment later, he gave her a small cookie. Luke looked at her closely and said in a block, "Unfortunately, wizards can't control their magic when stress reaches its peak." He said that it seemed like she didn't know what state she was in a while ago. Luke said, "Young lady," that she had to be especially careful. Of course, she had the necklace he gave her, but still she had to control herself. She asked if he wasn't curious why she wanted to escape from there. Luke sighed heavily and asked if she would tell if he asked her such a question. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed like he knew that she hated the crown prince. Luke said that, of course, he was aware of that. Arindi timidly said that it was related to him. She was puzzled because she didn't know how to tell her about such a thing. She couldn't say that this was all actually a fictional world, and that she was reborn into the body of a villainess, and died several times, and the source of all this was the crown prince. She was furious because this made her hate him to the depths of her soul. Luke looked at the young lady closely, and in a calm manner said that she didn't need to rush. She sighed heavily and said that there was a reason why she hated him, but unfortunately she couldn't reveal it. Arinde sighed heavily and said that this might all sound strange, but right now, what caused it had not yet happened. She was puzzled because she knew that he would change, but now he said that he was interested in her, but she hated him to death. But unfortunately she could not answer his question. Why was he unpleasant to her? She sighed heavily and said that she suddenly wondered if she was doing the right thing by expressing hatred towards him now, because she knew perfectly well that he hadn't done anything to her. Yet Luke looked at her closely and asked if that was such a reason that even other people might think that he deserved this hatred. She looked at him intently and said that if people believed her words, then everything was so. He looked at him intently and asked why she doubted it then. Luke said that the prince was the one who kept pestering her all the time. Although she had said from the beginning that she didn't like him, he didn't understand why she should put up with that. She sighed heavily and wondered why she had to endure this. She knew that he had no hesitation in killing her, even when she had not mocked his lover. He looked at her closely and with a soft smile said that she could do whatever she wanted, because even if she did something she shouldn't do, he would believe her. The young lady froze for a moment, not expecting to hear something like that. He smiled and said that therefore she should not be confused. Taking this opportunity, she should choose one thing. He smiled and said that if she continued to rush from side to side in the same spirit, it would only be hard for her. She thought for a moment, as he was suggesting that she trust her heart and do it the way she wanted. She knew that what she was doing now might be wrong, and maybe she shouldn't have done it. Arinde knew that she couldn't stand it any longer and be happy to become a bad person. Ariinda looked at her friend with a happy smile and thanked him because with his help, she put her thoughts in order. A little. Luke looked closely at the young lady and said that she did not need to try to cope with everything. Luke looked at her closely and said that she could just ignore the prince. He didn't understand why she kept accepting requests, the prince to talk. He said that she should avoid unnecessary fuss. She sighed heavily because she thought that she had listened carefully to everything he wanted to tell her. She looked at her friend with a smile, as she had just realized something. She knew that Luke needed her, and she needed him very much. She smiled and said that she seemed to have found a good partner. He smiled and said that he would bet that she would not find such a perfect partner wherever she went. She sighed heavily and said that as she thought she liked the young lady better, he was shocked by her statement and shouted that he bought her bread. A moment later, he extended his hand to her, and she reached out to him with a gentle smile. Some time later, they were all having dinner in a friendly company, and all were looking intently at the young lady. She looked away from them because yesterday she was consumed with the desire to escape, so she did not think about the consequences. She was puzzled because she realized that she had left her friend several times and disappeared without a trace. She looked closely at her friend and with a gentle smile asked if he was very angry with her. She understood perfectly well that he was not pleased with her disappearance. She was puzzled because only yesterday he had said that she had done wrong. When she left them alone, Arinda was perfectly aware that she had done the same thing that day. Arinda, she saw him staring at her with a hint of irritation. He sighed heavily and looking at the young lady said that he was not angry at all. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was looking at her with an angry face, because she thought that she would soon suffocate from his intense gaze. A moment later, he sighed heavily and apologized if he had inconvenienced her. The young people looked at him intently, as they were surprised that he apologized. He sighed heavily and said that he was angry not at her, but at himself. Reynolds said that at least he should have taken her away from there, or punched the prince in front of her. At least once the young lady was alarmed by his words. She screamed that his opponent was not just anyone but the crown prince himself. The young lady was well aware that the young man was a character from a novel who was a commoner. She wondered if he might not have known that her fiancé was the crown prince. A moment later she sighed heavily, as she realized that he might not know this, since he had not known who she really was on the first day of their meeting. Reynolds thought for a moment and said that he seemed to realize that there was a prince because he had red eyes. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he really didn't know. She said that she had more privilege and she could afford to indulge in some things, but he couldn't do that. He sighed heavily and said that he would be careful next time. She was shocked and wondered if he had done something wrong. The young man sighed heavily and, taken aback by embarrassment, said that he had hit him, but not hard. She was furious and did not want him to blush when he said something like that. Arindi sighed heavily and drooped, because yesterday, when her friend blocked her with himself, she even deliberately stepped forward because she was afraid that something similar would happen. Luke asked his friend with a happy smile if he had hit the prince. He smiled and said that it seemed like he had some use after all. The young lady looked at her partner with fury and told him to shut up. She looked at her friend with alarm and asked if he knew what he had done. He sighed heavily and said that he had hit the crown prince, and he himself understood it. Serena looked closely at the young man and said that her friend was now worried that there might be consequences. Arinda looked at her friend with tears in her eyes, as she understood that she understood her perfectly better than anyone else. Serene sighed heavily and said that harming a member of the imperial family was usually considered a grave crime. Arinda screamed that the prince had a disgusting character because last time he even said that he would kill her. Arinda hugged her friend, bursting into tears, and told her that she couldn't forget that the crown prince was useless trash. Serena smiled and said that she would remember that, but that wasn't what they were talking about now. Arinda looked at her friend intently and called out to him. She sighed heavily and said that he was a future knight and should not use violence recklessly. She said that his opponent was the crown prince, and this was not a simple problem that he could easily hush up. Luke looked at his friend with a happy smile and said that he liked what he did, and if anything, he could erase the prince's memory and he would forget about everything. The young lady sighed heavily and called her friend. Luke smiled a sly smile and said that he would keep his mouth shut. He knew that they couldn't use force recklessly. She looked at her friend intently and said that since he understood, he should not behave like that next time. He looked at the young lady intently and said that all he heard in her words was that he was not allowed to touch the young man because he was the crown prince. Reynolds, holding back his rage, looked hard at the young lady and said that he would do the same if necessary. He looked at the young lady intently and said that it was all because the prince dared to touch her. The young lady froze in place, which she knew was entirely her fault. Arinda knew that receiving sympathy beyond mere affection could harm everyone. She raised that a similar situation like today could happen many more times. She knew perfectly well how everything was supposed to happen, so if they made a mistake, she would think that everything was ruined. She knew that she had to find the best solution so that the guys would not suffer because of her. The young lady looked intently at her friend and called out to him. She sighed heavily and thanked him for his help. A moment later she looked up and, looking at her friend, said decisively that if the crown prince was crushed, it would be by her personally. Sometime later, they were sitting in the library and studying. Serene looked at her friends closely and asked if they were going to study for the exam. Arinda looked at the young lady warily as she saw her threatening smile. She looked at her friend intently as she wanted him to immediately turn his gaze to the textbook. She looked at her partner because she understood that he had simply sold his ingenuity and was now doing something else. She knew her friend couldn't say any harsh words to her partner, and even now she continued to glare at him. Arindi looked at the young man intently and called him irritably, telling him to put down his pencil immediately and get to work on his studies. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't need to study. She said that he was sitting here anyway and he needed to do something. He sighed heavily and asked who she thought was the one who had put up the barrier and kept the other kids from getting in their way. She smiled and said it was just a barrier and she could have made it herself. Luke said that the barrier that completely separates space is magic that can only be learned in the magic tower. Arianda looked at the young man closely and said that in that case, he could show her the formula because he had said earlier that he would teach her magic that could only be learned in the magic tower. They argued for a while about whether she could master this magic in a short period of time, but after a few seconds, Luke gave in and showed her the formula. He sighed heavily and asked if it was enough for her. A few seconds to remember everything. Her face was a little puzzled. She knew that it was enough. She looked at him intently and asked if he would have nothing else to do, if he would study. Luke looked at her in bewilderment, as he did not understand why she said such a thing. He said that her words made him nervous. The young lady smiled slyly and said that it was because she was going to do it. A moment later, she used her magic, and a dome rose above them. She understood that they should not underestimate her memory, because she was actually a person who had memorized an entire novel. Everyone was amazed because they did not expect that she could do something like that. Luke looked around the dome in surprise, as he didn't understand how she managed to do something like that. She smiled and said that she did it all with her great skills, so he could now learn from her. Luke turned around in surprise and asked if she was really talking to him about studying now. He said that he had never seen such a person before in the Living Magic Tower. A moment later, Arinda shouted at him to sit up straight and start studying. She said that he should open the book, stand up straight, and write evenly. The young lady looked at him with a sly smile and said that all other conversations would take place after school. A moment later, she looked at her friend closely and asked if she was okay. Serena looked at her friend with admiration and said that she was very cool. The young lady with the speed of lightning told her friends to keep quiet and concentrate on their studies. She looked at them closely, as she thought it would be a good idea to tell the boys a little about the expected exam questions. She knew that it would help her a lot, as they had already failed several times. She looked closely at her friend, as she really wanted to help him. She smiled and said that she would make their notebooks with possible exam questions for them, so they should read everything very carefully. Serena, looking at her friend, said that she would be only glad, but the young lady's arm would hurt after that. She smiled and said that everything would be fine, and Luke would help her. Luke looked at his friend with concern and said that it hadn't been long since her mana had been restored, so she shouldn't overdo it. She was surprised and alarmed because she did not understand why he had removed her dome. A moment later, she noticed that he was handing her a book. He looked at her intently and, showing her the book, said that this was his hostage. He smiled and said that she had said earlier that they would talk after group classes. The young lady followed her friend slowly and told him that their lesson would start soon. He smiled and said that it was not the first time they were late. Luke looked at her intently and asked if the lesson was more important to her than him. She sighed heavily and asked why he was asking obvious things, because if they were late, they would be running laps around the stadium again. He smiled and said that if she wanted, he could use memory-erasing magic. Arianda was a little surprised by his statements. She understood that he could do it easily. He looked at her intently and said that if she didn't know, Before how to make this barrier, there was only one explanation for it. She was able to remember everything in the shortest possible time. He looked at her intently and asked excitedly where she got this ability from. She looked at him in surprise and asked why she suddenly had to explain to him why she was smart. He sighed heavily and said that she was right, but it was a little upsetting. Luke slowly handed her the book and said that if she had such a talent, she should have told him earlier. She was surprised, did not understand why she should do this. He looked at her intently after a few seconds of silence and said that it would be even more fun that way. She looked at him in bewilderment as she did not understand what he was talking about. He shouted that if she had such a talent, then she should have immediately told her partner about it. He asked if she had heard of such a concept as trust. The young lady was shocked by his statement and asked what he was talking about. She screamed that she was not born for his joy. Luke was taken aback and said that was not what he had meant at all. With lightning speed, she turned around and said that it turned out they were late, so she would leave. A moment later, Luke grabbed her hand. She turned and said that his excuse would listen during the break. A moment later, he looked at her intently and asked why she was standing there. After some time, they were already in the auditorium. Serena looked closely at her friend and said that she returned very quickly. Luke called the young lady, but she ignored him. Serena wrote a short note asking her friend if they had really had a fight. Arinda wrote that it was not so, and she was the only one who was offended. Serena noticed that the young man's expression was puzzled. She asked her friend if it was because she had destroyed his barrier. Serena looked at her friend closely and asked if he was upset because she didn't tell him. Arindi wrote that she didn't hide it, and if she really wanted to hide it, she wouldn't have touched his barrier from the beginning. The ladies were slowly texting each other while the professor was giving them a lecture. Serena wrote that saying it directly and suddenly confronting a person with something he didn't know about were two different things. Serena looked at her friend with a tender smile and said that they loved her much more than she thought. Serena told her friend that the young man was still a child who was not used to showing his bruised feelings. Serena told her friend not to be too upset by her words because the young man was just a little mistaken. A moment later, the young lady noticed a note from his partner. He wrote that after fencing training, she should come to the room for magic lessons because he promised that he would teach her the magic of the magic tower. Orinde was a little surprised because he had not taught her magic all this time, and now he had a desire. He wrote that he thought she was not yet at the level to study magic. Serena looked closely at her friend and said that it would turn out that she was already used to fencing training because before that, it was difficult for her even to hold a fork in her hands during lunch. The young lady said with a happy smile that it seemed like her body had already gotten used to it because recently, if she didn't do any sports, her body ached. Reynold looked at her intently and started talking about intense training. The young lady said with a smile that, taking back her words, if she increased the level of training, now she might just pass out. Then, he looked at the young lady with a gentle smile because he knew that she could handle it and wanted to help her do so. She looked at him intently with a joyful smile because she understood what he wanted to tell her. Luke looked closely at the young lady and said that after training in fencing, she decided to practice magic. Reynolds sighed heavily and said that he understood everything and continued eating. Luke looked at him in surprise and asked if he was just going to continue talking and not say anything. Reynolds looked at the young lady and said whether it was magic or fencing, he was not going to interfere with the young lady's training. He knew very well that it was all part of the training. He smiled gently as he looked at the young lady and said that the main thing was that she would be able to improve herself, and that was enough. She asked, was he really going to charm her? Serena looked at her friend worriedly and asked if after fencing training she would go to study magic again. After having dinner, the young lady smiled and said that everything was fine. Orinde knew that everything would be okay since she had lived through a tougher school life in the past. Smiling, she told her friend that after she finished her chores, she would help her study too. Arindi smiled and said that on the contrary, she enjoyed spending time with her friend. The young lady looked at her friend with joy and said that she actually really enjoyed spending time together too. Serena pushed the salad away and said that she had said earlier that she would not take her salad anymore. Arinda sighed heavily and said that it seemed she had been caught red-handed. Lady smiled and told her friend that she should not be picky and should eat well. Serena looked at her friend closely and said with a smile that when she was done studying magic, she should come to her room so that they could study together. Luke looked at them with a sly smile and asked if he could come too. Arindi looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really going to sneak into the girls' dorm. He smiled and said that the Crown Prince had appeared in front of her room the other day. She said that after that, things had become much stricter. Luke smiled and said that since yesterday, he had developed a very strong interest in studying. He smiled and asked his friend if this was true. Serena looked closely at the young man and said that it wouldn't hurt for him to study for the exam too. Luke smiled and said that there were no more options. Ariande looked intently at the young man, as this look reminded her very much of a dance evening for beginners. She sighed heavily and said that she felt a bit uneasy at the moment. Some time later, the young ladies were very much puzzled and surprised. She realized that her experiences had become her reality. Luke greeted his friends with a joyful smile. Arianda sighed heavily and wondered if this was true. Luke smiled and asked if she really wanted to touch his body. She was shocked and shouted that he had really gone crazy. With lightning speed, she closed the door in front of them. The young men shouted to their friends that they should open the door faster. Arinda asked her friend if she should open it for them. The lady sighed heavily and said that their efforts were admirable. A moment later, the young lady opened the door for them and told them that if there were no people outside, they should transform back immediately, as she did not want them to enter the room looking like that. A moment later, Luke used his magic to transform, along with his friend. She smiled and said that it was some kind of surprise for them. A moment later, the young lady grabbed them with lightning speed and dragged them into the room. She was puzzled and scared because she knew that if they were caught, they would definitely be finished. Reynold apologized to the young lady since his friend had informed her earlier that she would definitely like the surprise. Serena looked at the young people closely and said that they were not here to have fun, but to study. Luke smiled and said that they could study now, and when they got tired, they could rest. After studying for a few hours, Luke sighed heavily and said that he was very bored, and also asked the lady if she really thought that they came to them just to study. She said that if he did not want to study, he could leave. The young man was puzzled. He said that it seemed like his partner was really heartless. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed like he was a partner she picked up off the street. Luke looked at his friend closely and asked if he thought that was too categorical of her. Reynold, in turn, did not answer his friend. Luke looked at the young man in bewilderment and wondered if he was asleep. A moment later, the young man fell onto the table with a thud. Serena told Luke to move the young man to her bed. He felt sighed and wondered if they could just send him to the dorm. She pouted and said that if he suddenly woke up, he would be confused. Luke slowly dragged the young man to bed and muttered under his breath that he would be even more confused if he woke up in someone else's bed. Arinde looked at the young man because she knew that he usually slept at this time. Luke looked at the girls closely and asked if they would be resting. After they finished, Serena smiled and said that they probably would. Luke smiled slyly and said that in that case, he would quickly end it. They were confused and did not understand what he was talking about. He smiled and asked what he needed to decide, because he could explain everything to them. Orindi looked at him in surprise and asked if he would really explain everything for her. He said that he would do everything, and she could go and rest a little for now. The young lady, in turn, slowly approached the young man, who was sleeping peacefully on the bed. She knew that if she folded his arms, he would make the perfect sleeping beauty. She looked at the young man intently, not taking her eyes off him, as she had not been allowed to look at him so closely. before she was getting to know his little habits that were not described in the book. The young lady slowly reached out to him. He took her hand. She was surprised and wondered if he was awake. Opening his eyes, the young man tenderly called her name. She froze for a moment, looking at him, not knowing what to answer. Her heart began to beat wildly in her chest. Arinde said with surprise that if he fell asleep again, she would remove her hand. Serena approached her friend and asked what she was doing. Arinda was taken aback and, with a timid smile, said that she was just checking if the young man was really sleeping. Serena smiled and said that everything was clear and also informed that she was finished with her studies. Luke, with lightning speed, grabbed the young lady by the hand and said that he had sent her to rest, and she had been doing all sorts of nonsense. She was puzzled because she did not understand what he was going to do, because he was looking forward to this time to rest. Luke sighed heavily and said that she was right, and a moment later he turned off the light. He smiled and asked if they knew the terrible history of their academy. There was a fountain in their academy. If you approached it at dawn, you could see bloody water in it. He smiled and said that if you look into the fountain and look into this bloody water, then a hand will come out of the fountain and drag the person right inside. While telling a terrible story, he grabbed the young lady by the hand and pulled her towards him. She screamed in surprise. A moment later, she struck him with fury, for her heart almost sank into her heels. After what he had done, she sighed heavily and said that he had frightened her, which was why her hands had gone into action. He said that in the future she should change her habits and use magic first. With tears in his eyes and a smile on his face, he said that his partner was a very scary person, and this was even more blood-curdling than the scary history of the academy. She said that if he continued to tease her this time, she would hit him right in the face. He smiled and said that he was very scared. The young lady wondered if she should hit him once. A moment later, the young man turned the light back on and announced that there would soon be roll call, and he needed to get back. Serena thanked him with a smile for everything, and also said that she was indebted to him. He smiled and said that it was fun and that they could see each other tomorrow. As he left, he said with a smile that he had heard that if you walked around his female dormitory, you could run into a ghost. Using his magic, he disappeared with the speed of magic and wished them good night. The young lady was puzzled. The next day, the young ladies were whispering to each other because they had seen girls in the girls' dormitory that they had never seen before. The headmistress tried to find the girls in the academic records, but could not find anything. The young lady in turn came closer to them and began to listen, since she understood who they were talking about. She was puzzled because she understood that they had done a lot of things after all. A moment later, she came into the office and, looking at her partner, asked how it felt to become a celebrity. Overnight, Luke looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She sighed heavily and asked if it would be right if she said that he had become a celebrity ghost. Ariinde sighed heavily and said that her friend was having a hard time and he should erase her memories of yesterday. Luke looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She screamed that he should erase the memories of the crazy prank. He looked at her in surprise and asked if it was really that shocking. Luke sighed heavily and said that unfortunately he couldn't erase the memory. She was surprised. She didn't understand why he couldn't do it. Luke said that if he was wrong, he could erase even those parts of the memories that shouldn't be erased. The young lady was taken aback and said that last time he confidently said that he was going to use memory erasing magic. He sighed heavily and asked if she really thought that using it on others and on them was the same thing for him. She understood that he didn't even pay attention to anyone outside his radius. Everyone else except them was just a trifle to him. She realized this was in a past life. The young lady sighed heavily and said that, in any case, he should not do anything like that. The young lady looked at her friend intently and said that they would have a joint fencing exam. Ariinde knew that in the original story, the prince and Luke had a duel, but she still wanted to pretend that she was hearing about it for the first time. They talked about the exams for a while, The young lady asked her friend if she didn't want to take the exams. Arinda sighed heavily and said that she didn't want the holidays to come after them. She understood that after the exams, she would have to return to her family's hellish mansion again. When she returns, she will suffer again from her brother. And unfortunately, the Duke will not leave her alone either. She will have to respond to the invitation, and the Emperor will continue to boast about her and the prince. Arinde sighed heavily and told her friend that if she tried to leave home this time, she should take her in. Luke looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was going to fight the prince in this exam. He said that she had trained hard and should defeat him. A moment later, the young men said in unison the words that the young lady had spoken a moment ago. She was puzzled, for he had parodied her in front of her. Arin sighed heavily and said that she did not know what to do, since the prince had been wielding the sword for a long time. Luke smiled and said that judging by yesterday's blow, and she should win. She smiled and asked if he wanted to get it again. Serena looked at her friend and asked if it would be better to take the accelerated supplement classes. Serena told her friend that she had a hard time because of the prince, and she really hoped that her friend could relieve her stress in this way. The young lady, in turn, thought for a moment about her friend's words. A moment later, she shouted that she would do just that. Reynold looked at the young lady closely and said that he had heard about the joint fencing test, and so he decided to help her with her training. The young lady knew that her friend hated the prince very much because of the whole situation. She did not play a very important role in the life of the young man. But still she was uneasy after a long fight. The young lady was defeated. She sighed heavily, and since she had already lost to him several times in a row, she understood that this was very difficult for her. Reynolds slowly walked up to the young lady and began to gently wipe her forehead. He sighed heavily and said that she had never held a sword before, and so she should not expect her skills to improve in one day. She sighed heavily and said that he could not tell her that she would win as empty words, so that she knew that winning was out of the question. He said that he should not carelessly utter words that he was not sure of. Arindi sighed heavily and said that it seemed like she had no chance of winning. The young man was taken aback and said that she was a quick learner. She sighed heavily as she saw that he first crippled her and then healed her. He smiled and said that she had been working hard on strength training all this time, so she had pretty good stamina. The young lady looked at him intently and then looked away from him in my direction, in embarrassment, as she remembered his gentle and beautiful face when he was resting peacefully. She was a little puzzled. As she suddenly remembered, his face became embarrassed. The young man came closer to her and tenderly called her name. She froze in place in surprise, because for some reason, it seemed to her that someone was calling her from the depths of her heart. She knew that she should keep her distance and not give hope. She was sure that he should not love her. She knew perfectly well that she didn't need this because she wanted to accumulate enough skills to win and let the prince taste defeat. He looked at her intently and called out. She smiled and said that they could fight again. She smiled and said that she would like to see the young people fight. Luke smiled and said that he could use magic. Reynold, in turn, was very surprised, as he did not know that the young man knew how to wield a sword. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she thought his skills were mediocre. Reynold was taken aback for a moment, as he had never fought a wizard who had sword skills before. The young lady smiled and quietly told her friend that she was sure he would win. Reynolds smiled back, glad for the support. A moment later, he told the young lady that they should fight one last time. She smiled and said that she would be focused this time. Luke was shocked and asked if they didn't want to ask him what he thought about it. A moment later, the young ladies watched the duel the young men and noticed that the wizard had mastered the sword well. In turn, Luke did not give up and attacked his opponent with fury. She knew that the book said that the young man had honed not only magic, but also fencing from a young age. But she knew that he was no match for the monstrous swordsmanship genius. But she noticed that his attack and defense postures were better than the textbook. But unfortunately, their fight did not last too long, as the young man was soundly defeated. He sighed heavily and told his opponent that if he had used magic, he would have definitely won. He shouted that it was not he who was weak, but the young man who was simply crazy in fencing. Arinde said with a smile that she knew this, and he didn't need to make excuses, and they should go and eat instead. He shouted that he would like to drink some water first. She smiled and said that he could go get a quick drink of water using teleportation. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really managed to wash his hair in such a short time. Luke sighed heavily and said that he just splashed it, and the water on his head was hot, and he had to survive somehow. The young lady smiled and thought that he did it on purpose. Sometime later, all the students were gathered for the exam. Luke sighed heavily and told the young lady that due to the fencing exam, his magic training had taken a back seat. Arinde said that she saw that the magic exam would be on the very last day, and besides, she was confident in it in her own way. The young lady looked closely at the swords, as she wanted to find the one she used last time. The young lady approached her friend and said that she had taken the sword. She smiled and said that she had deliberately marked her sword with red ink. The young lady happily thanked her friend for her help. A moment later, the young people froze in place and looked around. The prince looked at the young people with a Yara grin. The young lady was puzzled because she did not understand why she looked in his direction. The young lady looked at her friend and with a joyful smile said that she would definitely cope and win. Serena was confident of her friend's victory because she had prepared very hard. Milady looked at her friend intently and said that she was right. Luke walked closer to them and told the young lady that she looked pretty confident. She smiled and said that it was probably because she beat him yesterday. He sighed heavily and said that it was because he had twisted his ankle at that moment. The girls laughed and said that they didn't think so. Serena looked at her friend and said that she was first in line. This could be because she chose the student she wanted to fight with. A moment later, the man said they could begin the competition. A few seconds later, the first pair was announced, and everyone started whispering because they understood that this would be a duel with a predetermined outcome. After all, they knew that the girl could not defeat the guy, and besides, the prince had been practicing fencing for a long time. A moment later, the young people bowed to each other. The prince looked at the young lady with a grin and asked if she had personally requested the duel. She looked at him intently and politely sent him packing. A moment later, the man said that they should prepare for the fight. She knew that she shouldn't worry about the fight and should concentrate on her opponent. She sighed heavily and remembered her mentor telling her that she should follow the sword. She knew that she had to concentrate so that she wouldn't hear any extraneous sounds. With lightning speed, the young lady dealt the first blow to her opponent. The prince was a little surprised by her grip and strength, but he parried her blow. He cried out in surprise and asked if she really knew how to wield a sword. The young lady parried his blows with lightning speed. She understood that the attack pattern was exactly the same as described in the novel. She knew that if her predictions were correct, this time he would strike from the right side. To be honest, she didn't think she could defeat the prince with just a few hard training sessions. Even if she memorized all the fencing, she wouldn't be able to keep up with the changes in the situation. But now she understood that she could win because everything was in her head. Arinde looked at him with a grin and said that she saw that he had time to talk. The young lady, in turn, began to employ the tactics that Luke had used in the original story. A moment later, she noticed that the prince was approaching her at a furious speed. She was a little impressed, as everything was happening as she expected. She pretended to point the sword to the left, and at that moment, she stretched out her hands. At that moment, the prince missed. A moment later, the young lady struck her blow, and the duel was over. The prince standing frozen in shock as he was defeated. A moment later, it was announced that the young lady had won. The hall was shocked, but at the same time glad that the prince had been defeated. Luke sighed heavily and, looking at the young lady, said that if he had known that this would happen, he simply would not have supported it. Serena smiled and said that only a young lady could defeat a prince, but besides, it was unethical to ridicule a loser. The young lady sighed heavily and told her friend that she was right, as she had misspoken, for the thought that none other than the prince had lost was imprinted in her mind. Moments later, the young lady turned around and greeted her friend. Reynolds looked at his friend and said that he had already heard the news, but he still wanted to hear it from her, personally, since everyone around him was talking about it. She smiled and told her friend that it was all thanks to his help. She said that she was going to tell him first, but the situation turned out a little differently. He smiled and said that he understood everything, and it was the result of her hard work, so there was no need to thank him. Luke looked at her closely and asked if she felt better. She smiled and said that of course she felt better, because she had let out everything that was on her mind. Reynolds looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and said that he was very glad about it. The young lady was a little alarmed by this display of interest on the part of the young man, and it especially bothered her when her friend was nearby. She knew that if she avoided it, it would be more awkward, so she wanted to act as natural as possible. Reynolds said with a gentle smile that they could see each other a little later since the bell had already rung. The young lady smiled and said goodbye to him. She stared at the young man as he walked away, knowing that this was not her area, as she needed to have experience in relationships, which she did not have. The next day, the young lady walked slowly to the dining room, as if to find out what was for dinner that day. Moments later, the young men told the young lady the whole menu with lightning speed. Luke smiled and said that she was also due wonderful love from him. She sighed heavily and said that she did not want to receive the last ones. He sighed heavily and said that she was neglecting his sincerity. The young lady sighed heavily and said that he had fallen asleep during the lesson. He smiled and asked why he thought he had fallen asleep. He said that she should have guessed everything right away. She looked at her friend intently, frozen in silence, as she wondered why this had happened. Luke smiled a timid smile and said that he had not touched their memory. A moment later, he said that he should still say that he had touched her. He smiled and said that everyone now had the idea in their heads that the young lady had always been good at fencing. She was shocked. She didn't understand how he could talk about it, as if nothing had happened. He sighed heavily and said that he dozed off a little, and there was nothing wrong with that. She was shocked because she understood that he had touched the memories of all the people in the academy. He smiled and said that it was okay, because she was uncomfortable, and he helped her a little. She was shocked and didn't understand why he was so happy. He sighed heavily and said that if she didn't like it, he could take it all back. She said that she liked it all. She didn't need to take it back, but she was still worried about whether he could use his abilities like that. Arinde sighed heavily and asked why he had done this for her in the first place. Serena looked at her friend closely and said that they loved her more than she knew, and if they had the same abilities as the young man, they would do the same for her. She looked at her friend closely and asked if she was overestimating their relationship. Arinde sighed heavily as she decided to go down a path that was different from the original story, but in turn, she continued to place the boys within the framework of the novel. She looked at her friend intently and shyly shouted that she would have done the same. The young lady looked at her friend with a gentle smile and said that it was time for them to go. Arinde looked at her friends with a gentle smile and said that the guys were no longer following her, so she could finally live a normal life. Luke looked at her closely and asked if it was she who had reproached him earlier, saying why he had gone so far. She sighed heavily and said that she was determined to accept what he had given her. Arinde understood perfectly well that before the main character was the priority, and now all the honors went to her. The young lady looked closely at her friend and asked what she was thinking about so much. Arinde looked at her friend with a gentle smile and said that she was thinking about how beautiful she was. Serena, with an embarrassed smile, said that she thought about it too when she looked at her. Luke sighed heavily and said that he sometimes wondered how long he had to put up with their indecent behavior. The young lady smiled and asked her friend if she should tell him that he was handsome too. He smiled and said that she didn't have to say that, because he was always handsome. Reynolds told his friend to keep quiet. Luke was shocked as his friend had kept quiet about all this, but now he opened his mouth. Reynolds sighed heavily and told his friend that if he was going to talk complete nonsense, he better keep his mouth shut. Reynolds looked at the young lady intently and asked if that man would harm her any more. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand who he was talking about. He said that he was talking about the crown prince now. The young lady was a little puzzled, because she didn't understand why he had to do that. Luke smiled and said that even if the prince showed up before he did anything, he would throw him into some mountains. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was a very good idea, but he would still get punished. She looked at them with a smile and said that everything was fine now and they shouldn't worry about her so much. Reynolds asked the young lady if she was angry anymore. She sighed heavily and said that she thought for the rest of her life she will never get rid of this anger. She looked at her friends and said that she wasn't just angry, she literally hated him. Reynolds was surprised by his friend's statement and asked what the crown prince had done to her. She sighed heavily, not knowing what to answer, and looking calmly at her friend, she asked if he really thought she was going too far. He sighed heavily and said that she doesn't hate anyone without a reason, so she must have a good reason for it. He looked at her intently and said that he believed her. She looked at him with a surprised smile, as she realized that it was still joyful to hear that someone trusted her. She thanked the young man with a smile, as she was glad to hear his words. Luke sighed heavily and said that honestly, if you look at the things he did, even if you really wanted to, you just couldn't like him. Ariandi smiled and asked if her friend knew what he said to her at the duel. After copying the prince, she looked closely at everyone present and said that he had previously asked her if she had personally requested the duel. Luke smiled and asked what she said in response. The young lady sighed heavily and said that of course she sent him to hell. He smiled and said that he expected nothing less from his partner. Serena looked at her friends and said that she didn't like to gossip about other people, but he was too rude to the young lady, and she hated that too. Arindi shouted that she was not satisfied with just one victory in the duel. The young man looked at her in surprise and asked what she was going to do next. She looked intently at her friends, who were waiting for her answer. The young lady looked at them intently and with a wicked grin, asked if anyone wanted to have a little fun with her. They discussed the insidious plan of revenge for some time. Reynolds sighed heavily and asked if it was possible to just hit the crown prince and then apologize. The young lady sighed heavily, as she knew that he would definitely have problems after this. Serena sighed heavily, asked her friend for forgiveness for not being able to help in any way. Arinda said that they could get back together in the room and come up with a cunning plan for revenge. The young lady shouted to her friends not to dress like girls this time, and they better take advantage of those deportations. Luke wanted to object, but the young lady glared at him for several minutes. He sighed heavily and said that he would not do that. She looked at him intently and shouted that this time he should not tell scary stories. Luke looked at her with a smirk and asked why he shouldn't do it. He wanted to know if she was so scared, then that she couldn't sleep. The young lady looked away from him and muttered something to herself on the tray. A moment later, the young lady froze in place as a brilliant idea came to her. She looked at her friends and said with a grin that she had just come up with a really great idea. The prince walked slowly along the dark alleys of the academy. He was puzzled because he did not understand why the young lady asked for a meeting at such a late time, because she wanted to meet him, and said that if he did not come to the meeting, she would immediately break off the engagement with him. A moment later, he turned around in fear as he saw someone's silhouette. He froze in place, in shock, as he saw the ghost watching him intently. A moment later, the ghost motioned for the young man to approach the fountain. The prince, in turn, slowly approached the fountain and froze in place. He was puzzled because he saw bloody water. A moment later, someone came up to him and whispered quietly in his ear. He shuddered and fell into the fountain with a crash of fright. He rose and froze in place from the silk as he saw the young lady. She looked at him with a grin and asked what all that splashing in the fountain was about in the middle of the night. The next day, Madame looked closely at her students and said that there had been a lot of bad rumors going around the academy lately. She asked the young people if anyone from the National Academy, where the smartest people in the empire gathered, still believed in ghost stories. She said they had better prepare for their exams. The young lady quietly whispered to her friend that it seemed like all this happened because of yesterday's incident. Yesterday, the Crown Prince's young men used magic. Finally, Madame shouted at the young people not to spread stupid rumors, but to concentrate on their studies. The young lady turned around and saw that her friend was sleeping quietly. Moments later, he woke up and looked intently at the young lady. He smiled a radiant smile, and she realized that he was not yet fully awake. Luke sighed heavily and asked why the room was so quiet. She said that a professor had come to them and told them not to believe any stupid stories. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed like they had had a very good joke, but there were still some guys who believed it. He continued talking about the young lady while she stroked his head. He looked at her intently and said that it was a very strange feeling, as it seemed to him that he had become her precious pet. She smiled and said that in that case, he should try meowing. He sighed heavily and asked if she could stop treating him like a pet. She smiled and said that later she would buy him all the bread he wanted. He smiled and started meowing and barking and asked what else he wanted. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't want it to be some kind of horrible mix-up. He smiled and said that if you connect cute things with cute things, it will be even cuter. A moment later, the young lady pinched his cheek and said that if he had come to his senses, they should meet Reynold. He sighed heavily and said that they could tell the young man to come to them. A moment later, the young people slowly walked away along the academy alley. Serena, looking at her friend, said that tomorrow approximately, the shower of exams would be over. Arinde smiled and said that everything was exactly like that, and also asked her friend what she would do during the holidays. In the original story, she was selected as a scholarship student with good grades and went on a tour to the Imperial Palace for a few weeks. But this time the young lady did not apply for the tour to the palace. The lady wondered if the young people hadn't felt anything for each other. She knew that by now they must have encountered each other several times. She smiled and said that if she listened to her heart, she would like to go on a trip, but from a financial point of view, it was quite a burden. Arinde smiled and said that she had a lot of money. Serena sighed heavily and said that she could not accept such a gift, and also asked her friend where she was going. Lady said that she would like to go on a trip, but unfortunately, no one would let her go. Of course, she was not the kind of person who would be stopped by this. But in any case, if she suddenly disappeared, everyone would rush to look for her with burning eyes. She understood that this was not because of concern for her, but because of concern for the relationship with the imperial family. She wanted to break off the engagement as quickly as possible, so that she would be thrown out of the house and then she could live in peace. Luke looked at the young lady closely and asked if she really wanted to leave. She was taken aback and screamed, as he had frightened her very much. Luke asked if she didn't want to go back to the mansion. The young lady nodded in turn, agreeing with his question. She knew that no one in their right mind would want to return to the mansion. Anyone in her place would want to run away from home immediately. She knew that no one in the house was on her side, except the maid, because she was only expendable there. Luke said with a smile that in that case there was one way. He smiled and said that during the holidays she could work as an intern at the Magic Tower. Before Luke could finish speaking, the prince suddenly came up and called the young lady. She sighed heavily, as she did not want to see him. He looked at her intently and said that they needed to talk. Arinde, with lightning speed, shielded her friend with her body, as she did not want to give her to him. He sighed heavily and, looking intently at the young lady, said that he would like to talk to her. She realized that he could fall in love with the young lady at any moment. She knew that before that happened, she had to break off the engagement. She understood that no matter how much protection the Magic Tower had against the engagement, it would not free her. Arindi, looking at the prince, she said that he looked quite healthy for a man who decided to splash in a fountain at night. She said that she thought he would catch a cold. He looked at her closely and asked if she had told anyone about this situation. She said that her friends had heard about it. He said that he was not talking about that now and had only come to inform her of the order. She casually said that she didn't listen to orders from people weaker than her, and if he was going to inform her of something, he had to defeat her first. The prince sighed heavily and said that he needed to convey the emperor's will. The emperor ordered the young lady to stay in the imperial palace during the holidays. The prince looked at her intently and said that she must receive an education worthy of a future empress. The young lady was shocked by what she heard, because in the original, everything was not like that. Luke smiled and hugged the young lady with lightning speed and informed her that she would be working in the magic tower as an intern. The prince froze in surprise for a moment. The young lady looked at the prince with a smirk and said that he should tell the emperor that if he wanted to pull her out, he should first ask permission from the corner magic tower. She said with a smirk that of course he wouldn't do that. A moment later, with the help of magic, they left the prince. Reynolds looked at the lady intently and said that if it was the emperor's order, then she could not disobey it. She said that the magic tower and the imperial family had made a pact with each other and that nothing could be done about what she had promised to do. The young lady was delighted because she knew that this would be her most ideal holiday. She looked at her friend closely and asked what interns do. He smiled and said that he had already been an intern and that she didn't really need to do anything. He thought that she wouldn't want to go home, so he had specially saved one spot. She smiled and said that he seemed to be a very influential man. He smiled and said that if he wanted, he could transfer a small section of the magic tower into her possession. Arinde sighed heavily and said that she refused because she wanted a weak and long life. Reynolds looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she would really be spending the entire vacation only in the magic tower. Luke smiled and said that she could leave the magic tower on weekends. He said that it was illegal, of course, but they could go abroad. The young lady was shocked because she knew that in this life, she had never been outside the empire. The young lady looked forward to the journey with joy. She was also very keen to attend the night market festival. The young lady looked at her friend with admiration and shouted that he was really great. Serena looked at her friend with surprise and said that she had assumed she had been abroad often. Arinde sighed heavily and said that she had never been abroad. The young lady looked at her friend intently and said that she also wanted to go on the trip with her. Arinde looked at her friend closely and said that it would be very good if they went on a journey together. She asked Luke if it would be too difficult. He smiled and said that it was not difficult, and if she wanted it, then he had to do it. She sighed heavily and said that she was grateful to him, but still it did not suit him to say such phrases. He smiled and said that he himself had goosebumps after the words spoken. Serena looked at the young man closely and said that she would also like to go on an excursion to the magic tower, at least for one day. Luke looked at her in confusion, not understanding why she needed this. She smiled and said that she would miss her friend very much, and she thought it would be nice to visit her. Luke sighed heavily and said that he didn't think he could do it. He asked if she knew where the magic tower was. Arinde knew perfectly well that they could get there very quickly via teleportation. But since the young lady was a civilian, she would have to spend several nights in a carriage. Arinde looked worriedly at her friend and said that it would be very dangerous for her to go alone. Reynolds said that she would not be alone. The lady looked at them in surprise and asked if everything would be okay because they would be riding in the carriage for a very long time. Reynolds smiled and said that if he had such weak stamina, he would not be able to control the sword. The young lady happily said that it was a great idea, since everyone agreed they would go on a trip. Sometime later, the young lady was sitting in the hall, waiting for the ceremony to announce the holidays. But before the ceremony, she had two pieces of news, one good and one bad. The good news was that Reynolds Fine had avoided failing his exams. Earlier, the Duke shouted that the magic tower was very good for the young lady, but still she would disobey the order of the Emperor himself. He was puzzled and did not understand what the girl was doing in the tower at all. With the help of her magic, the young lady turned over her father's table, as she did not want to listen to such things. The Duke screamed and froze in shock. She looked at him intently and said with a smirk that if she wanted she could burn down the mansion with ease. The Duke was shocked. He couldn't understand how she dared to threaten her father. He shouted that she seemed to be okay with him stopping giving her pocket money. She said that would be nice, and at the same time they could end their connection as parent and child. Later, the young lady received a reply from her father, who agreed with her to go to the magic tower, as the Emperor saw it as an opportunity to establish a connection with the magic tower. Serena looked at her friend closely and said that she didn't seem to be in the mood. Arianda sighed heavily and said that she just had a lot of thoughts in her head. The young lady smiled and said that she didn't need to rush because they were just getting started. Arinde smiled and said that she was right, and there was no need for that. For some time, they sat happily and discussed the upcoming trip. A moment later, a young man approached them and greeted them with a smile. Arinde looked at her friend and asked if she had any goals that she would like to achieve during the holidays. She said that Luke told her that he was going to finish the research he hadn't been able to complete before joining the academy, while Reynold, in his usual manner, would be training in all his free time. Arinde, in turn, planned to study many different magics at the Magic Academy. The young lady smiled and said that she just wanted to rest this time. Arinde smiled and said that rest could also be called a goal, and that was a very good idea. Sometime later, the young people argued about what their friend would do in the magic tower. Serena told her friend that it would be nice to visit the capital one weekend. She smiled and said that there was a festival coming up soon, and so they could attend it and also eat a lot of delicious food in the capital. A moment later, they were informed that the holiday announcement ceremony had begun. Luke looked closely at the young lady and said that she needed to get ready and go quickly. Moments later, he looked at the young lady in surprise and asked if she was going home. She sighed heavily and said that he had teleported her too. With lightning speed, he started pushing her out of the room. He said that she could have a good rest and not come to the magic tower. The young lady was shocked. She said that because of him, they couldn't say goodbye properly. He sighed heavily and said that it was because they really needed to hurry, since there was very little time left before the appointed meeting time. And given the old man's character, they should not be late. The young lady froze for a moment and began to guess who he meant. A moment later, he used his magic and said that they were leaving first. The young lady, in turn, was taken aback as she now understood who he was talking about. With lightning speed, they teleported. The man looked at him intently and said that he had arrived exactly before the appointed time. Luke asked the man if he should not praise him for arriving a little early. The current head of the magic tower sighed heavily and said that he said that you need to value your own time. A moment later, the man began to lecture the young man, but he interrupted him and asked him to calm down. The man, in turn, looked intently at the young people as they held hands tightly. The young lady let go of her friend with lightning speed. After bowing, she introduced herself. The chief smiled and told the young lady that she seemed to be adjusting well. She looked at him in confusion. He managed to say that it must have been hard for her to drag such an obnoxious child around with her for a whole semester. He understood perfectly well that she had a very hard time. The man sighed heavily and said that they would talk about it later. He looked at the young lady closely and said that it seemed like she was a valuable talent that he had acquired for the first time in a long time. Luke smiled and said that it was all because she was feuding with the imperial family. After a short conversation, he led her into the apartment with a smile and said that she could stay there. She was surprised because it was huge. The young lady, in turn, said in surprise that even the prince did not live in such apartments. He smiled and asked if this was too big a bedroom for one person. She sighed heavily and asked what he was going to say next. He smiled and asked if she wanted him to live here with her. She sighed heavily and said that she would refuse such an offer. The young man was a little surprised because the young lady had been calling the prince by name all this time. She sighed heavily and said that to tell the truth, she had been calling him a roe deer. Luke was surprised. The prince's nickname amused him, and he laughed wildly. She sighed heavily and said she didn't think the nickname was funny enough to make her squirm like that. Luke smiled and said that he thought so too, having justified it. He looked at her intently and said that it lifted his spirits. He smiled tenderly and said that it was probably because of that which he liked. Once she had a dream, but it was more like the memories of a real villain. She was confused because she didn't understand why she was seeing the memories, but unfortunately, she couldn't understand her true feelings, because the one who was pierced by the point of the sword was she. A moment later, the young lady opened her eyes and screamed. Luke looked at her in surprise and asked with a smile if she had really had a good dream. She sighed heavily and said that she had had a terrible dream. He smiled and said that it seemed that he had not appeared to him. She looked at the young man in surprise and asked what he was doing there. He said that quite a long time had passed since breakfast, and he thought that she would not wake up, so he came to wake her up. He smiled and said that it was already lunchtime, and he had to find out whether his partner was alive or not. The young lady, in turn, wanted to know how long he had been in the room. He smiled and lightly slapped her on the forehead and told her to stop looking like that. She sighed heavily and said that she would come to him after she washed herself so he could go to the lab first. He asked in surprise if she knew the way. The young lady said that he could tell her once and she would find the way. A moment later, he told her the entire route with a joyful smile. He smiled and asked if he needed to repeat it one more time. She sighed heavily and said that there was no need to do that, and she understood everything. He asked in surprise if she had really learned everything he had just said. Luke said worriedly that he could have waited for her and then teleported her. A moment later, the young lady repeated exactly what he had said. He smiled and said that it was all correct. Luke came closer to her and stroked her head with a heavy sigh. He looked at her intently and said that she should come when she finished everything, but before that, she should knock on the door several times. She was surprised, did not understand why she should do this.